The snow came down hard and fast, the kind that buried everything in minutes and made the trees look like they were slowly disappearing into a white fog. Mara Calloway had been hiking for nearly 4 hours when the wind changed direction, and the temperature dropped so sharply that she stopped walking just to make sure she was still breathing properly. She was, but barely. The Northern Rockies in late November had a way of reminding every person who entered them that nature did not care about schedules, research grants, or the warm sleeping bag back at the base station. It only cared about survival, and tonight, survival was going to require more than a good pair of boots and a detailed map. Mara was 29 years old and had been a wildlife field researcher for 6 years. She had studied elk migration patterns in Montana, tracked bear populations through Idaho, and spent 14 months living in a research tent in the Canadian wilderness logging wolf behavior. She was not the kind of person who scared easily. She had faced a charging moose once and stood her ground until it changed direction. She had been caught in a lightning storm on an exposed ridge and crawled on her hands and knees for nearly half a mile to reach tree cover. She was calm under pressure. Her supervisor, Dr. Owen Price, had written in her last performance review that Mara possessed what he called wilderness composure, which he described as the rare ability to think clearly when the situation around her was anything but clear. Tonight, her wilderness composure was being tested. She had gone out at midday to check on a series of camera traps she had placed along the eastern slope of Miller Ridge, a long spine of rock and timber that ran north to south through the heart of the Colton Wildlife Corridor. The corridor was a federally protected strip of land, roughly 40 miles wide and 70 miles long, that connected two larger wilderness areas. Wolves had been reintroduced to the corridor 8 years earlier, and the population had grown steadily. Mara's current assignment was to document pack behavior during winter months, when food became scarce and territorial lines were tested most sharply. The cameras had been placed well. 3 of them had captured footage she was genuinely excited about, a pack of 9 moving in tight formation through a narrow valley, the lead female breaking trail while the others followed in her exact footsteps to conserve energy. It was the kind of footage that took months to get and told researchers more about wolf intelligence than any laboratory study ever could. She had been feeling good, even cheerful, as she started the long walk back to her station. And then she heard it. It was a small sound. Not the kind of sound the forest usually made at night. The wind made noise. The trees creaked and groaned. Distant animals moved through underbrush and sent tiny crackling sounds across the frozen ground. But this was different. This was a sound that did not belong to the environment. It was thin and high and desperate, and it was coming from somewhere beneath the roots of a large fallen spruce tree, about 30 feet to her left. Mara stopped immediately. She clicked off her headlamp. In complete darkness, she stood absolutely still and listened. The sound came again. It was a whimper. She knew that sound. She had heard it before, in recordings, in field notes, in the careful academic descriptions that wildlife biologists used when they documented the vocalizations of wolf cubs under stress. But hearing it in the open wild, on a frozen hillside at 9 in the evening, with no other wolves anywhere nearby, was something she had never experienced before. She waited 30 seconds, then a full minute. She scanned the darkness around her, looking for the reflective glow of animal eyes. There was nothing. Whatever had made that sound was alone. She moved slowly toward the fallen spruce, stepping with deliberate care, keeping her weight evenly distributed so the snow did not creak too loudly under her boots. She crouched low as she approached the root system of the fallen tree, which had been pulled from the earth when the tree fell, and now formed a tangled wall of frozen soil and exposed roots. There was a hollow space beneath it, maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep, filled with dry needles and dead leaves that the snow had not yet reached. And in that hollow, pressed against the furthest wall, was a wolf cub. It was small, probably 6 to 8 weeks old, though it was difficult to judge in the dark. Its fur was a medium gray, with darker patches along its spine, and a pale cream patch beneath its chin. It was trembling, not just from cold, but from fear. Its eyes were open and fixed on her with an expression that carried the particular kind of terror that only very young animals display, the pure, unfiltered panic of a creature that does not yet understand the world well enough to know what is dangerous and what is not. But it did not run. Either it was too weak, or it had nowhere to run to, or it had already learned in its short life that staying still was sometimes the only option left. Mara did not move. She stayed crouched at the entrance to the hollow and let the cub look at her. She kept her breathing slow and quiet. She did not reach forward. She did not make any sudden movements. She simply stayed there, in the cold and the dark, and waited for the cub to decide what it thought of her. After about 2 minutes, the cub whimpered again. It was not an aggressive sound. It was not a warning. It was, quite simply, the sound of something that was cold and hurt and alone, and had no idea what to do next. Mara reached into her pack and pulled out a small flashlight, covering most of the beam with her gloved fingers, so that only a thin sliver of light escaped. She angled it carefully toward the cub, trying to get a better look without blinding it. What she saw made her chest tighten. The cub's left front leg was wet with blood. The fur around it was matted and dark. Something had injured it. She could not tell what from this distance, but it was clearly a wound that had been bleeding for some time. The leg was held at an awkward angle. Not broken, she thought, or at least she hoped not, but definitely damaged. The cub needed warmth. It needed care, and it could not stay where it was. She thought through her options quickly. Leaving it here was not a real choice. A wounded cub alone in the wilderness on a night like this would not survive until morning. The temperature was already well below freezing and falling. If a predator did not find it, the cold would. And wolves did not abandon their cubs willingly. The fact that this one was alone meant something had gone wrong. The mother might be dead. The pack might have been scattered. Something had separated this cub from its family, and that something had not been gentle about it. She could call for help, but her radio signal out here was unreliable at best, and by the time any help arrived, the cub would likely be gone. She could flag the location and come back at dawn with a rescue team, but that carried the same problem. She could not, in good conscience, walk away from a living creature that was this young, and this injured, and this alone. She made her decision the way she made most decisions in the field, by trusting what she knew and moving forward. She removed her outer jacket and laid it on the ground in front of the hollow. Then she reached into her pack and found the small emergency kit she always carried, the one that contained, among other things, a pair of thin nitrile gloves. She pulled them on. Then she took a slow breath and spoke to the cub. She spoke in a low, steady voice. Not words the cub could understand, obviously, but the rhythm and tone of a voice that was not threatening. She had read research that suggested young wolves responded to vocal cues from humans similarly to how domestic dogs did, particularly when the voice pattern was calm and non-aggressive. She did not know if it would work. She tried it anyway. The cub pressed further against the back of the hollow. She waited. She kept talking, quietly, about nothing in particular. About the forest. About the snow. About how cold it was and how she wished she had brought more coffee. Absurd, maybe, but it kept her voice steady and gave the cub something to track that was not a lunge or a grab or anything sudden. After nearly 10 minutes, the cub shifted slightly. Its ears, which had been flat against its skull, moved a fraction of an inch forward. It was still afraid, but it was listening. Mara reached out slowly and placed one hand, palm down, on the ground, at the edge of the hollow. She did not push it forward. She just let it rest there. The cub looked at it. Another minute passed. Then, with the kind of fragile, tentative movement that makes a person hold their breath without meaning to, the cub stretched its nose forward and touched the tip of it to her gloved knuckle. She did not move. The cub sniffed again, longer this time. It was reading her, trying to understand what she was and whether she was safe. She stayed completely still and let it work through the process at its own speed. And then, in a moment she would think about for a long time afterward, the cub took one small, limping step toward her. That was enough. She moved carefully, scooping the cub into her jacket with slow, deliberate hands, wrapping it before it had time to properly panic. It struggled briefly, a short, frightened burst of movement, and then it went still. Not still in the way frightened animals sometimes go still when they give up, but still in a way that felt almost like exhaustion, like it had run out of the energy needed to be afraid. She held it against her chest and stood up. The forest was silent around her. No movement in the trees, no sound other than the wind and the steady, soft fall of snow. She stood for a moment and scanned the shadows carefully, aware that the mother of this cub could be anywhere, aware that approaching a wolf cub when its mother was nearby was the kind of mistake that ended badly. But there was nothing, just the trees, the dark, and the cold. She adjusted the cub against her chest and started walking. Her station was about 2 miles northwest, a converted ranger cabin she had been using as a base for the past 3 months. It had a generator, a small heating unit, basic medical supplies, and enough food to last another 6 weeks. It was not a veterinary clinic, but it was warm and it was safe, and right now, that was what mattered most. She walked quickly, but carefully, watching her footing on the icy ground, keeping the cub tucked against her core for warmth. It made small sounds occasionally, tiny vocalizations that were not quite whimpers and not quite growls. She talked to it the whole way, continuing the low, steady stream of words that seemed to keep it from panicking completely. By the time she reached the tree line at the edge of the clearing where her station sat, she had decided on a name for it. It was gray as ash, and had come out of the cold and the dark like something pulled from the edge of extinction. She called it Cinder. She pushed through the station door, stamped the snow from her boots, and carried Cinder directly to the small work table in the center of the main room. She cleared a space, laid out a clean cloth, and set the cub down carefully. It immediately tried to stand and move away. She placed one gentle hand on its back to hold it still, not pressing hard, just enough to keep it from toppling off the table. She worked quickly, examining the leg under the bright overhead light. The wound was a deep laceration along the outer side of the left foreleg, roughly 3 inches long. It had bled significantly but had partially clotted. There was bruising around it and some swelling, but when she gently manipulated the leg, she did not feel the telltale grinding sensation of broken bone. It was a serious cut. Something with sharp edges had done it, she thought, not teeth, something harder, metal possibly. Her stomach turned at the thought. She cleaned the wound carefully with the antiseptic solution from her kit, moving as gently as she could while the cub squirmed and made its complaints known. She applied a thin layer of antibiotic ointment from a tube she normally used for her own cuts and scrapes. She wrapped the leg with the cleanest material she had, a strip of sterile gauze from her first aid kit, and secured it with medical tape. It was not a professional job. A veterinarian would have done it differently, but it would hold, and it would keep the wound clean through the night. She warmed a small amount of water on her camp stove and offered it to the cub in a shallow dish. For a long moment, Cinder sat rigid on the table, ears flat, watching her with wide, suspicious eyes. Then, slowly, it lowered its head and drank. She exhaled. She set up a box near the heating unit, lining it with spare fleece and an old blanket, and settled Cinder into it. The cub circled once inside the box, exactly the way dogs circle before lying down, and then curled into a tight ball and closed its eyes. Mara sat down on the floor next to the box and pressed her back against the wall. Her legs ached from the hours of hiking. Her hands were still cold despite the warmth of the station. Outside, the wind was building into something that sounded more serious than it had an hour ago. She listened to it push against the walls of the cabin and thought about everything she would need to do in the morning. She would need to contact Dr. Price. She would need to reach the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center, which was 60 miles south, and ask for guidance. She would need to think carefully about how to handle Cinder's care without causing the cub to become too habituated to human contact, which would make its eventual return to the wild far more complicated. There was a lot to figure out, but not tonight. Tonight, the cub was safe. Tonight, that was enough. She leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She did not sleep, not exactly, but she rested, and in the box beside her, Cinder breathed in slow, even rhythms, the small sound of it just barely audible over the wind. She was almost fully drifted when something made her open her eyes. It was not a sound. It was more like the absence of a sound. The wind had not stopped. The station was not quiet, but something in the ambient pattern of the night had shifted, the way a room changes when someone else enters it, even before they speak. She raised her head and looked toward the small window on the north wall of the station. In the darkness outside the glass, 2 pale points of light reflected back at her. Eyes. Large eyes, low to the ground, unblinking. She sat perfectly still. The eyes held steady for a long, measured moment. Then, as smoothly and silently as they had appeared, they were gone. No sound of movement, no crack of a branch or crunch of snow. Just there, and then not there. Mara sat in the quiet for a full minute after the eyes disappeared. Her pulse was steady. Her mind was working through what she had seen, cataloging it, placing it in context. Wolf. Almost certainly wolf. The height of the eyes, the width between them, the color of the reflection, all of it said wolf. A large one. She looked down at the box where Cinder slept. The cub's ears had not moved. It was still breathing slowly, still curled tight, still lost in whatever dreams wolf cubs have on their first night, in a warm, strange place. Mara got up, walked to the window, and looked out into the dark. There was nothing there now. Just the snow, and the clearing, and the trees standing in their rows at the edge of the light like an audience, waiting for something to begin. She stayed at the window for a while, then she went back to her spot on the floor, pulled a blanket over herself, and waited for morning. She did not feel afraid. But she did not feel alone either. And in the cold forest outside, in the spaces between the trees where no light reached and no human eye could follow, something that weighed more than 100 pounds, and moved without making a sound, turned, and walked back into the dark. The morning came pale and gray, the sky the color of old pewter pressed flat against the tops of the pines. Mara woke before the sun had properly cleared the ridge, and the first thing she did was check on Cinder. The cub was awake, sitting upright in the box with its ears forward and its nose working steadily. It looked better than it had the night before. Its eyes were brighter. The trembling was gone. When it saw Mara lean over the edge of the box, it pulled back slightly, but it did not make a sound. Just watched her with those sharp, careful eyes, reading her the way it had been reading everything since it first opened them on the world. She warmed water again, and added a small amount of powdered electrolyte supplement she kept in her kit for long field days. She offered it to the cub. This time, Cinder drank without hesitation. Good sign. She looked at the wrapped leg. There was no fresh blood on the bandage. Another good sign. The swelling still looked significant, but the cub was bearing a small amount of weight on it when it shifted position, which meant the injury was uncomfortable, but not incapacitating. Mara made herself coffee on the camp stove, and sat at her small desk to write up her notes from the previous night. She always wrote while things were fresh, while the details still had their exact texture, before her brain started rounding edges and smoothing out the rough parts of what she had experienced. She wrote carefully and precisely about where she had found the cub, the condition it was in, the approximate location of the fallen spruce relative to her camera trap positions, the appearance of the wound, the steps she had taken to address it, and, at the end, the 2 points of reflected light in the window. She wrote that part with particular care. Then she reached for her radio. Dr. Owen Price picked up on the fourth call, his voice carrying the slightly distracted quality of a man who had been in the middle of reading something when the radio interrupted him. He listened without speaking while she explained what had happened. When she finished, there was a pause. A cub, he said. 6 to 8 weeks, maybe. Possibly a little older. The leg wound was the main concern last night. It looked stable this morning. And no sign of the pack? No adults in the vicinity when you found it? None. I searched the immediate area for about 10 minutes before I moved it. Nothing. Another pause. She could hear him thinking through the implications, the same way she had been thinking through them since the moment she picked the cub up off the frozen ground. A lone cub this young was not supposed to exist. Wolf cubs at that age were completely dependent on the pack. They did not wander. They did not get separated under normal circumstances. Something had gone wrong, and the nature of what had gone wrong would determine a great deal about what happened next. The eyes at the window, Dr. Price said. Yes. You're confident about the size? Based on the height and spacing of the reflection, yes. We're talking about an adult wolf, at minimum. Possibly a large adult. He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was measured, the way it always was when he was working through something he did not fully understand yet. If the pack found you before you found them, that changes the situation considerably. I know. They may have been tracking the cub. That's what I think too. Which means they know where it is. Yes. Mara. He stopped. Started again. Be careful today. Don't go far from the station. Keep your eyes open. She told him she would. She did not mention that she had already been planning to stay close. She did not mention that when she had gone to the window that morning, just after waking, she had stood there for nearly 5 minutes studying the tree line, and that somewhere in those trees, something had shifted, just once, very slightly, in a way that could have been wind, and could have been something else entirely. She ended the call and went back to her desk. Outside, the snowfall had lightened. The clearing in front of the station was undisturbed and white and blank, a clean page with nothing written on it yet. She drank her coffee and began to plan her day. By mid-morning, she had checked the bandage on Cinder's leg and replaced it with a cleaner wrap. The wound looked as though it was beginning to close at the edges, which was a better outcome than she had feared. She offered the cub a small amount of raw meat from the freezer section of her camp cooler. She had a limited supply, kept mostly for her own meals, but she could spare enough for the next few days. Cinder sniffed it for a long time before eating, which was exactly what it should have done. Wolves, even very young ones, did not eat without investigating first. It was an instinct that had been shaped over thousands of years, and even a cub that had never been in real danger yet carried that careful wariness in its blood. She let Cinder rest through the early afternoon, and spent the time reviewing the footage from the previous night's camera traps. She had 6 cameras active on the eastern slope, each set to trigger on motion and record in 30-second bursts. She pulled the footage onto her laptop and began working through it systematically. Most of what she found was the expected collection of deer, a red fox moving through a narrow gap in the rock, a large porcupine that had walked directly across the path of the camera and given her a perfect side view shot. She smiled at the porcupine and saved the frame. Then she moved to the last camera, the one positioned on the high point of the ridge, overlooking the valley. She clicked through the timestamps. Wind-triggered frames, a branch dropping snow, 2 deer in the distance, barely visible through the trees. And then, at 11:47 in the evening, 40 minutes after she had reached the station with Cinder, a figure. She leaned forward. It was large. Larger than any wolf she had seen in person during her time in this corridor. It was moving along the upper edge of the valley with a steady, unhurried pace that had a quality she could only describe as purposeful, like something that knew exactly where it was going. The camera angle was from above and to the side, which gave her a reasonable view of the animal's proportions. Its shoulders were high and heavy, its head was large, its tail was held low but not tucked, the posture of a wolf that was alert and focused but not afraid. Its coloring was difficult to determine precisely in the infrared footage, but it appeared pale, not white, exactly, but significantly lighter than the gray and black wolves she had been documenting in the corridor over the past 3 months. It moved through the frame in 7 seconds. Then it was gone. She replayed the clip 6 times. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she opened her field log and began to type. What she typed was not scientific language, at least not at first. It was a set of questions she had not had before, but had now. Why was a lone wolf of this size moving along the ridge late at night? Where was it going? Was it the same animal that had looked through her window? And if it was moving in the direction of the station, was it tracking Cinder by scent? Had it been following the cub before Mara found it, watching from a distance, waiting to see what would happen? The last question was the most unsettling, because if the answer was yes, it meant that the wolf had watched her pick up the cub and carry it away. It had watched her do that, and it had followed her, and then it had stood outside her window in the dark and looked in. And it had not done anything else. She thought about that for a long time. In the box near the heater, Cinder made a small sound, not quite a bark and not quite a howl, something in between. A short vocalization that wolf researchers sometimes called a location call. Young wolves used them to announce their position to members of their pack. It was instinctive. The cub could not help making it. Mara looked at the box. Then she looked at the window. The tree line was still. The clearing was still. Nothing moved. But she felt, in the way that people who spend long enough in wild places begin to feel things they cannot fully explain, that the stillness was not empty. It had weight to it. It had direction. She got up and walked to the window. She stood there, looking out at the snow and the pines and the flat gray light of the afternoon. She stood there for a long time. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees, so faint she might have imagined it, a sound rose and fell on the cold air. A single low note. Not a full howl, just the beginning of one, cut short, as if the animal that made it had thought better of completing it. As if it was sending a signal, not a call. As if it was saying something private, something meant for a specific listener, not the whole forest. The sound lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then it was gone, and the afternoon was quiet again. Cinder, inside the box, had gone perfectly still. Its ears were raised, its body was rigid, and its small gray face was turned toward the window with an expression of absolute, focused attention. Mara watched the cub and felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear. Something more complicated than fear. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding. The sense that she had stepped into a situation that was larger and older and more complex than she had realized when she picked a wounded animal up off the frozen ground the night before. She had done something simple. She had helped a hurt creature. That was all she had meant to do. But the forest had its own understanding of what she had done, and whatever that understanding was, it was moving toward her on quiet feet through the dark space between the trees, taking its time, in no particular hurry, because it knew exactly where she was. She turned away from the window and went back to her desk. Outside, the afternoon light continued its slow, steady fall toward evening. The snow in the clearing caught the last of it and held it briefly, turning the white ground a pale, cold gold before the color faded and the gray came back. The temperature dropped another 4 degrees. The forest went still in the way it always did just before dark. Every creature that moved by daylight, heading to wherever it went at night. Every creature that moved by darkness beginning to stir. The next morning, Mara decided to hike back to the camera trap on the high point of the ridge. She needed the memory cards, and she needed to see the terrain in daylight. She left Cinder in the box with water and a small portion of meat, secured the station door, and started up the slope before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridgeline. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that made the inside of your nose feel like it was lined with something brittle. She moved at a steady pace, keeping to the path she knew, watching the ground for ice patches and the trees for anything that moved at the wrong speed. The forest was quiet in that deep, genuine way it had in very cold weather. A quiet that was different from the quiet of an empty place. It was the quiet of a full place holding its breath. She was 40 minutes up the slope and still a quarter mile from the ridge camera when she heard the engine. It was faint at first. She stopped and listened. Definitely an engine. More than one, possibly. Coming from the direction of the old logging road that cut along the western boundary of the corridor. A road that was technically closed to public use after the 1st of November, but that had, in her experience, never been particularly effective at stopping the people who did not want to be stopped. She moved off the main trail and into the trees, instinctively, without deciding to. She had spent enough time in the backcountry to understand that if you heard an engine in a place where engines were not supposed to be, you found out what it was before you let it find out what you were. She worked her way through the pines toward the sound, moving quietly, watching where she placed her boots. Through the trees, she caught the flash of something metallic. She stopped and crouched behind a broad fir trunk and looked. 2 trucks, one dark green, one black, both large and fitted with the kind of oversized tires and roof racks that suggested regular off-road use. They were parked on the old logging road, which ran about 300 feet below her position on the slope. 3 men were standing between the trucks, and a 4th was walking a slow loop around the area, looking at the ground, looking at tracks. She watched. The man studying the ground was wearing heavy boots and a dark jacket and moving with the careful attention of someone who knew what he was doing. He stopped at one point, crouched, studied something for a long moment, then straightened and said something to the others that she could not hear at this distance. The others moved toward him. One of them, a man with a gray beard and a red jacket, looked in the direction of her camera trap. He raised a pair of binoculars. She pressed herself closer to the fir trunk. The binoculars swept the slope slowly. She did not move. After a long moment, the man with the binoculars lowered them and said something. Another one of them, younger, in a green jacket, pulled a folded paper from his pocket. A map. She was too far away to see what kind of map, but she could see him unfolding it and the others gathering around it, and the way they were oriented, all of them looking up the slope in the same direction. The direction of the ridge. The direction of her cameras. The direction she had been walking when she heard them. She stayed behind the tree and thought very carefully. These men were not hunters, at least not in any licensed, legitimate sense. The corridor was closed to all hunting. She knew what licensed hunting parties looked like, and she knew what their equipment looked like, and none of what she was seeing matched that picture. The men at the trucks had the systematic, business-like quality of people, with a specific objective, and they were looking at a map, and looking at the slope, and they had been examining tracks, and the tracks in this part of the corridor, on this slope, above this specific section of valley, could only belong to a handful of animals. one of which was a very large, very pale wolf. Her phone, which had almost no signal out here but occasionally caught a single bar when positioned exactly right, buzzed once in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out carefully, shielding the screen with her body. A text message, from a number she recognized as Pete Cole's personal phone, not his work line. Pete was a junior wildlife officer assigned to the northern section, one of Gary Marsh's people. She did not know him well, but she trusted him reasonably. The message said, "Heads up. Word came through this morning that a group was spotted pulling onto the old Devlin logging road last night, with a transport crate in the truck bed. No plates recorded. Thought you should know since you're up that way. Stay safe." She read it twice, then she put the phone away. Transport crate. Not the equipment of someone who wanted to photograph a wolf or observe one from a distance. Not even the equipment of someone who planned to do it harm at range. A transport crate was what you brought when you planned to take something alive. She looked back through the trees at the four men below. The one with the gray beard was pointing now, indicating a direction along the logging road. Another man was walking toward one of the trucks, opening the rear door, pulling something out. From this distance, she could not identify it precisely. Long and dark, and carried with the casual confidence of someone familiar with it. She had seen enough. She began to move back the way she had come, keeping the trees between herself and the logging road, moving with the same deliberate care she used when she needed to be quiet, but also fast. She kept her footfalls light. She did not break branches. She breathed through her nose. By the time she reached the main trail, she was moving at a near jog, and by the time she cleared the tree line at the top of the slope, she was running. The station door was where she had left it. She went inside, locked it behind her, and went directly to her radio. She got Gary Marsh on the first try. He was in his truck, from the sound of it, and he listened without speaking, while she described what she had seen. The trucks, the men, the tracks they were examining, the direction they were looking, the message from Pete Cole. When she finished, he said, "How many?" "4 that I saw." Pete's message mentioned a transport crate. "Are they still on the Devlin Road?" "As far as I know, yes. I came back fast." "All right, stay inside. Lock your doors. I'm sending Pete up from the south end, and I'll come from the Valley Road. It'll take Pete 40 minutes, me, about an hour." "Gary." "What?" "They were looking at the slope above the ridge cameras. They had a map. I think they know something is up there." A pause. His voice, when it came back, was controlled, but carried something underneath it that she recognized as urgency, held carefully in check. "They won't get far on that slope in these conditions. Not quickly. And Pete will be there before they make it up." "I know." "Mara, stay inside." She agreed. She ended the call and stood in the middle of the station and looked around at everything she had, her cameras, her recordings, her field notes. Cinder in the box near the heater, awake now, watching her with those bright, attentive eyes. She thought about the pale wolf on the camera footage, moving through the valley in the dark. She thought about the eyes at the window, and the single, cut-short note from the trees, and the 7 seconds it had stayed in frame before disappearing. She thought about 4 men with a map and a transport crate. And she thought about what she was going to do next. Because she was going to do something. She was not the kind of person who locked a door and waited for other people to arrive. She was not built that way. But she was also not impulsive, and the situation called for clear thinking rather than reaction, and so she made herself stand still and breathe, and think through what she actually knew, and what she could actually do, and what the difference was between being careful and being passive. Outside, a branch cracked under the weight of accumulated snow and fell to the ground somewhere in the tree line. Cinder did not react. Mara did not react either. But she moved to the window, and she stood there, and she watched the slope above the cabin, with the same steady attention she had been trained to bring to the observation of wild things, the kind of attention that did not flinch and did not jump to conclusions, but did not look away either. Whatever was coming, she would see it. And she would be ready. Gary Marsh arrived in 53 minutes, which was 7 minutes faster than he had estimated, and Pete Cole arrived 11 minutes after that, which meant Pete had driven the southern access road in conditions that his supervisor would probably want to have a conversation about later. Both of them came to the station door, rather than trying to intercept the men on the slope, which Mara took as a sign that either the situation had changed, or Gary had made a tactical decision she was not yet aware of. He had. He explained it standing in the middle of her station, still wearing his jacket because he was not planning to stay long, his eyes moving around the space with the habitual assessment of a man who had spent 30 years doing a job that required him to understand situations very quickly. "We have 2 more officers on the logging road," he said. They parked before the Devlin turnoff and went in on foot, so the men with the trucks would not see them coming. "The plan is to let them get close enough to be clearly in violation. They are already in violation just by being on that road, but we want them to do something actionable. And then move." "The transport crate," Mara said. "Yes. Possession of that equipment in a protected wildlife corridor, combined with the map and the tracking behavior you witnessed, gives us considerably more to work with than if we just turned them around at the road. How long? An hour. Maybe 2. Depends on how fast they try to move up the slope." He looked at her steadily. "Pete is going to stay here." Pete Cole, who was standing near the door with his hands in his pockets, and the particular composure of a young person trying to look like someone who did not find any of this alarming, gave her a brief nod. "All right," she said. Gary left. She heard his truck start and pull away down the access road. Then the clearing went quiet again, with only Pete's presence in the station, and Cinder in the box by the heater, and the weight of the morning pressing down on everything. Pete looked at the box. "Is that Cinder?" "Yes." He looked at the cub for a long moment. Cinder looked back at him with the flat, measuring attention of a young animal that had already learned that most things in the world required careful evaluation before they could be trusted. Pete did not try to approach or speak to it. He simply acknowledged it was there, and looked away, which was exactly the right response. "How long have you had it?" he said. "Since last night." "You found it alone?" "Under a fallen spruce on the eastern slope, left leg laceration, significant, but not critical. It was alone, no pack activity anywhere in the immediate area when I picked it up." He nodded slowly. "The footage Gary mentioned, the large pale wolf on your ridge camera." "Yes. You think it's connected to the cub?" "I do." He looked at the window. The slope above the station was visible from where he stood, a stretch of white terrain between the tree line and the ridge line, clean and undisturbed in the morning light. Nothing moved on it. "The men on the Devlin Road," he said, "if they have information about a wolf that size in this corridor." "Then someone told them," Mara said, "which means there's more to this than 4 men with a map." He looked at her. "It's not a small operation," she said. "That's not what it looks like." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it's not." She poured him coffee, and they waited. The call came from Gary, at 11:23. It was brief. The officers on the logging road had made contact with the 4 men, who had at that point advanced approximately halfway up the slope toward the ridge cameras. The encounter had gone without incident. The men were being held for questioning at the road. Gary was requesting that Mara come down to provide her account of what she had witnessed that morning. She asked about the transport crate. Gary said it was in the truck bed, open, empty, and fitted with the kind of interior padding used to prevent injury to large live animals during transport. She asked Pete to stay with Cinder, and drove down the access road to the logging road junction, where she found Gary's truck and 2 additional wildlife service vehicles, and the 2 dark trucks she had seen from the slope, now with their doors open, and the contents of the vehicle beds being documented by a young officer with a camera. The 4 men were standing at the edge of the road near the tree line. They had been separated from each other, which was standard. She looked at them as she walked past. 2 of them were men she did not recognize, both somewhere in their 30s, the practical, outdoor weathered look of people who spent a lot of time working outside. The third was a man with a gray beard who was talking calmly to one of the officers in a way that suggested he was not particularly worried, which itself was a kind of information. The fourth, the younger one in the green jacket, was looking at the ground. She gave her statement to the officer with the camera, carefully and completely, describing what she had seen from the slope that morning: the trucks, the positions of the men, the one studying tracks, the map, the binoculars, the direction of their interest. The officer recorded everything she said, and asked clarifying questions, and thanked her when she was done. On her way back to her truck, Gary fell into step beside her. "The gray-bearded one," she said quietly. He was not worried. No, Gary agreed. That suggests he believes he has done nothing that cannot be explained away. Possibly, he glanced at her, or he believes he has more support than a wildlife officer on a logging road represents. She thought about that on the drive back to the station. Pete was exactly where she had left him, standing near the window, watching the slope. He had not moved the chair closer to the heating unit, or found anything to read, or done any of the small comfort-seeking things that most people did when they were waiting in an unfamiliar place. He was just standing there, watching. She revised her opinion of him upward slightly. "How is it?" she asked, meaning Cinder. "Slept for a while, drinking when I offered water, looking around a lot." She checked the cub. Stable. Better, possibly, than that morning. She replaced the bandage with fresh material, and noted in her field log the time and the condition of the wound. She noted the presence of Pete Cole and the events of the morning. She noted the 4 men on the logging road and the transport crate. Then she sat at her desk and tried to think clearly about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, did not wait for her to work through it in an organized way. It arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, in the form of 2 additional trucks coming up the access road. Not wildlife service vehicles, not Gary Marsh, but 2 trucks she did not recognize, moving fast and not particularly carefully, on the icy road surface, pulling up to the edge of the clearing, with the particular energy of people who had come, because they had heard something, and were not happy about it. Pete was at the window before she was. His body language changed in a way she noted, not dramatically, just a slight shift in how he held himself, a settling and a steadying, the way a person shifts when they move from observation into readiness. "That's Phil Garrett's truck," he said. "Who is Phil Garrett?" "He is the reason the other 4 men were on the logging road this morning." She looked at the trucks. She could see through the windshield of the first one that there were at least 2 men inside. The second truck was larger, and she could see the shape of something in the bed, covered by a tarp. "How many?" she said. "I count 5, maybe 6. She went to the radio. Gary picked up immediately, as though he had been waiting for her to call. He had. He had been monitoring the access road remotely and had seen the trucks turn up from the main road. He was already on his way back. "Do not go outside," he said. "I know. Pete, are you there?" Pete leaned toward the radio. "Yes. Stay with her. Do not engage." "Understood." Gary ended the call. The men outside the trucks were not moving toward the station. They were standing in the clearing, and they were looking at the station, and there was a conversation happening between them that she could not hear. The gray-bearded man was not among them, which meant he was still at the logging road with Gary's officers, which was one less thing to manage. Phil Garrett, she assumed it was Garrett, the one Pete had identified by his truck, was a large man in a dark jacket who stood with the careful stillness of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the right moment to act on it. He looked, she thought, at the station with an expression that was not quite what she would have expected, not aggressive, not impatient, calculating. He was reading the situation the same way she was, and he was good at it, which was more concerning than if he had simply been impulsive. "Pete," she said quietly, "how long has Garrett been operating in this area?" 3 years, minimum. Possibly longer. Gary has had his eye on him for a while, but there's never been enough to move on formally. "What does he move?" Pete hesitated for a moment. "Animals. Primarily large predators. Live capture and transfer. His clients are overseas, mostly." She looked at the covered shape in the bed of the large truck. "That is a transport crate under the tarp." "Yes," Pete said. "A big one." She thought about the pale wolf on her camera footage, the size of it, the movement through the frame. 7 seconds, and she had known immediately that it was something outside the range of what she had documented before. She thought about someone looking at that same animal and seeing not what she saw, an extraordinary, living, sovereign creature, but a product, something with a price attached to it. The thought settled in her chest like a stone. Outside, one of the men by the trucks was moving toward the station. Not Garrett, one of the younger ones, walking with deliberate ease, the body language of someone playing at being relaxed. He stopped about 15 feet from the door. "Hello?" he called. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. "Anybody home? We're having some truck trouble, and wondering if you have any tools we could borrow." Pete looked at her. She shook her head slightly. The man outside waited a moment. Then he said, At the same conversational volume. "We know you're in there. We saw the smoke from your stove." She went to the window, keeping to the side so she was not centered in the glass. She looked at the man outside, and then at the group by the trucks, and then at Garrett, who had not moved and was watching the station with that careful, measuring attention. She picked up the radio again. Not Gary. Gary was coming, and she could not speed that up. She called the Wildlife Crime Line, a direct number she had been given as part of her research protocols for reporting illegal activity in protected areas. She gave her location, her name, her affiliation, and a clear account of what was outside her door. The person on the other end took the information without urgency, but with complete attention, and told her officers were being dispatched, and to stay inside and not engage. The man outside the door knocked. Not aggressively. 3 measured knocks, the cadence of a person who was being polite on purpose, making a point of being polite, using politeness as a pressure. She did not answer. She went back to the window and looked at Garrett. He was looking back at her. She could see his face clearly through the glass, and what she saw confirmed what she had thought when she first observed him. He was not going to rush this. He had time, he believed, and he was going to use it. He had been doing this for 3 years without being formally charged, which meant he was careful, and careful people did not lose their patience over a closed door. But he also had not driven up that access road for nothing. She looked at Cinder. The cub was sitting upright in the box, perfectly still, listening to the knock and the voice outside, with a quality of attention that was almost painful to watch. Its ears were trained on the door. Its nose was working, and its body was rigid in a way she had not seen since the night she brought it in. Not the fear of the first night, something different, something more specific, like it was reading the information the outside air carried and finding something in it that it knew how to name. She crouched beside the box and put her hand in, letting the cub press its nose against her fingers. Cinder pressed hard, holding contact, and the rigidity in its small body shifted slightly. Not gone, but the sharp edge of it softened. "I know," she said again. She was saying it a lot lately. It seemed to be the most honest thing available. Outside, the man at the door had stopped knocking. She heard footsteps moving away, back toward the trucks. At the window, she saw the group reassembling, saw Garrett receiving whatever report the young man had to give him, saw the flat line of Garrett's expression as he absorbed it, and turned back toward the station, with the look of someone revising their plan. Gary's truck came up the access road at 3:12 in the afternoon, and the wildlife crime officers arrived 9 minutes after that, and the clearing that had been a standoff became something more complicated, and more procedural, and considerably safer, in the immediate physical sense, than it had been for the past hour. Garrett and his group did not resist. They did not need to, not yet. They answered questions in the careful, minimal way of people who had lawyers and knew how to use them, and they allowed their vehicles and equipment to be documented, and they waited. 2 of the men were taken back down the road for further questioning. Garrett himself was at the center of a long conversation with Gary, and one of the wildlife crime officers that she could see through the window but could not hear, and at the end of it, Garrett walked back to his truck and drove away, and the large truck with the covered transport crate drove away after him. Gary came inside and sat down, and looked at her for a long moment. "He has not broken any specific law that we can prove, today," Gary said. "Being in the corridor with a transport crate is not itself illegal. Attempting to find a wolf is not illegal. We have your account of the men on the slope, which is a violation of the closed road protocol. We are charging 2 of the 4 men from this morning with unlawful presence in a protected corridor. The other 2, including the one Pete identified as organizing their presence, had documentation that creates enough ambiguity to slow things down. But, he leaned forward slightly. Dale Overton is going to want to hear about today." She had not heard that name before. Who is Dale Overton? Federal wildlife crime investigator. He has been building a case for 18 months that has, as of this morning, been given a new piece of evidence by the events on the Devlin logging road. What piece of evidence? Phil Garrett, showing up at your station. The same afternoon, 4 of his people were stopped on the slope. Gary looked at her steadily. That is a pattern. Patterns are evidence. She thought about the pale wolf on the camera footage, moving through the valley in 7 seconds, pale against the dark of the trees, unhurried and large and entirely itself. She thought about it now, somewhere in the northern section of the corridor, moving through a landscape that people had been watching and measuring and filing reports about for years, without once catching it on a sanctioned camera or placing it in an official record. 7 years of that, Pete had told her. Maybe longer. 7 years. And these men had come today with maps and crates and organized intent. She looked at Cinder. The cub was finally lying down again, curled in the box, eyes half closed with the particular drowsy quality of a young creature that has burned through its available adrenaline and is ready to sleep. It looked very small against the blanket. It looked, in that moment, exactly like what it was, a young animal that had been through too much and was now resting in the only warm place available to it. She was not going to let anything happen to it. And she was not going to let anything happen to the pale wolf that had followed her to this station and stood outside her window in the dark and organized 12 wolves in a careful perimeter around a clearing because it wanted its cub back. She did not have the words yet for exactly how she was going to prevent those things from happening, but she would find them. She always did. She turned to Gary and said, "Tell me how to reach Dale Overton." The cold had a particular quality in the hour before dawn. It was not simply a low temperature. It was something more active than that, something that moved through every gap in the station walls with careful precision, finding the edges of windows and the space beneath the door, and the small imperfections in the insulation that Mara had been meaning to address since October. She had learned to sleep in layers during her time in the Northern Rockies: 2 pairs of thermal socks, fleece trousers, a long-sleeved base layer, and a thick flannel shirt. But even so, she always woke in the hour before the sun came over the ridge, with the sensation that the cold had been working on her while she slept, testing her, seeing what it could get away with. She woke at 5:14 in the morning. Not because of the cold, not because Cinder had made a sound. She woke because somewhere outside, not close, but not far either, a sound moved through the air that her sleeping brain could not file away as ordinary and let pass without waking her up to deal with it. She lay still for a few seconds, listening. The sound did not come again. She got up and moved to the window. The clearing was dark. The snow held a faint blue-gray luminescence from the sky above, which was beginning, very faintly, to brighten toward the east. The trees stood in their usual black rows at the edges. Everything looked as it should. And then her eye caught movement, just at the tree line, on the north side of the clearing. A shape, low and moving slowly, crossing from one cluster of trees to another, then another shape, then a third. She counted. 5, 6, 7. By the time she stopped counting, she had reached 11, and there were more shapes still moving at the edges of her vision, sliding between the trees with that fluid, ground-covering walk that was unmistakably wolf. They were not running, they were not rushing toward the station, they were simply moving into position, spreading out along the perimeter of the clearing, in a slow, unhurried arc that was more systematic than anything she had expected to see. She felt the hair on her arms rise beneath her sleeves. She made herself breathe slowly. She made herself think. 11 wolves, possibly more, moving into a loose ring around the clearing that contained her station, not closing in, not approaching the station directly, just surrounding it, positioning themselves. The way a careful thinker surrounds a problem before deciding what to do about it. She looked for the pale wolf, the large one from the camera footage, the one that had stood at her window 2 nights ago. She could not immediately identify it in the darkness. The shapes at the tree line were not fully visible, just impressions of movement and stillness, the occasional shift of a form against the dark background of the trees. Then she looked toward the south side of the clearing and found it. It was standing alone, well clear of the tree line, in the open snow of the clearing itself. No other wolf was near it. It was set apart from the rest, and it stood with the particular stillness of something that has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to act on it. Even at this distance, and in this dim light, she could see that it was significantly larger than the wolves at the tree line. Its shoulders were high. Its head was up. Its eyes, when they caught the faint ambient light of the pre-dawn, reflected back with the pale silver-green glow that large predators carry, the kind of glow that exists at the intersection of biology and something that feels much older than that. It was looking directly at the station. Mara did not step back from the window. She stood there and looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked at the station, and between them was 30 feet of frozen ground and a sheet of glass that felt, at that particular moment, extremely thin. She thought through what she knew. Wolves did not typically behave this way around human structures. They avoided human contact in the overwhelming majority of cases. Even habituated wolves, those that had grown comfortable enough with humans to reduce their avoidance distance, did not surround buildings before dawn with the deliberate organization she was watching now. This was not normal behavior, and the fact that it was not normal told her something important. This was a response to a specific event. It was a response to Cinder. She turned and looked at the box near the heater. The cub was awake, sitting upright, its ears at full height. Its nose was moving rapidly, reading the air that came through the station's imperfect seals. It had known, Mara realized, before she did. It had been awake before she woke up. It had been sitting in that box, smelling the outside world changing around it, smelling the arrival of something it recognized in the deepest part of its instinct. She knelt beside the box. Cinder looked at her. Its expression was different from what she had seen before. The fear was not gone, not entirely, but it was no longer the dominant thing in those eyes. What had taken its place was something harder to name. Alertness, certainly. Recognition, maybe. The particular intensity of a creature whose world has just snapped back into focus after a period of confusion and pain. "I know," Mara said quietly. "I hear them." She went back to the window. The pale wolf had not moved. The others at the tree line had settled into stillness. The clearing was very quiet. The snow between the station and the tree line was unmarked, which told her that none of them had come closer during the time she had been looking away. They were holding position, waiting. She sat down at her desk and thought carefully. Dr. Price had told her to be careful. She had agreed. But she was beginning to understand that careful in this situation did not mean what she had initially assumed it meant. It did not mean staying inside and hoping the wolves got bored and left. It did not mean calling for help and waiting for someone to arrive and figure this out for her. It meant something more specific and more immediate. It meant understanding what was happening and making deliberate decisions in response, not just reacting to each new development as it arrived. What was happening was this. A large and apparently organized pack had tracked its missing cub to her station. The cub was alive. The cub was inside. The pack knew this because wolves communicated in ways that humans were still, after decades of research, only partially beginning to understand, through scent, through vocalization, through the behavior of other animals in the area, through information networks that had no cables and no towers but worked with a reliability that modern engineers would have envied. They had not approached the station. They had not behaved aggressively. They were doing something that, in its own way, was considerably more sophisticated than aggression. They were establishing a perimeter. They were making a statement. And the statement was clear enough that even a human, which was a species not particularly gifted at reading the language of wolves, could understand it without difficulty. The cub is ours. We know it is here. We are waiting. Mara opened her radio. She called Dr. Price at 5:41 in the morning, and his voice when he picked up carried the particular flatness of someone who had been awake for hours already, which suggested that he had not stopped thinking about their previous conversation. She told him what she was looking at. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "How many?" "At least 12 visible, possibly more in the trees." "And the large pale one is in the clearing itself?" "Yes. In the open, by itself." He exhaled. It was a long, measured breath, the kind that preceded a careful statement. "Mara, I need you to listen to me very carefully." "I'm listening. What you are describing is not normal pack behavior. The size you're describing for that single animal, if your camera footage is accurate, is not typical for any documented wolf in the corridor. The organization of what you're seeing, the systematic positioning, the single large animal, in a separated position of apparent authority, that is not behavior we have documented in this region." "I know," she said, "which means we are working without a map here." "I know that too." Another pause. "What is your instinct telling you?" She looked out the window at the clearing. The pale wolf had not moved. The sky was beginning to lighten more noticeably now, the first genuine suggestion of dawn creeping up behind the ridge to the east. In that growing light, she could see the pale wolf more clearly. It was not, she realized, a wolf she had ever captured on camera before. She would have remembered. She would have noticed. There was no record in any of her field documentation of an animal this size in this corridor. "My instinct," she said, "is that this animal has been here a long time, longer than we have been watching." "Yes," Dr. Price said, That's my instinct too. And my instinct is that it is not going to leave. No, he said. I don't think it is. She closed her eyes for a moment, opened them. Then I need to figure out what to do about Cinder. Yes, he said again. You do. She ended the call and sat with the decision for a while. Outside, the dawn was coming. Inside, Cinder made another small sound, that half vocalization, that location call. And outside, at the tree line, something answered it. Just barely audible. Just enough. The clearing was no longer quiet. It was full of things being said in a language she could not fully speak, between creatures who had known each other long before she arrived, in a place that had its own rules and its own history. Rules and history that she was only now beginning to understand she had stepped into. She looked at Cinder. Cinder looked at her. All right, she said, quietly, to the cub and to herself, and to the cold air of the station, and to the morning that was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. All right, let's figure this out. She spent the rest of the early morning doing what she always did when she needed to think clearly. She worked, not on the immediate situation, but on the documentation of it, because documentation required precision, and precision required her to look at things exactly as they were, rather than how she feared they might be. She reviewed all the camera trap footage from the previous 48 hours. She cataloged each wolf she could identify in the pre-dawn footage, noting size, coloring, and position relative to the others in the clearing perimeter. She could distinguish approximately 8 individuals clearly enough to create basic behavioral profiles. The other 4 or 5 were in positions and lighting conditions that made precise identification impossible. The pale wolf appeared in 3 additional clips she had not yet reviewed, each from different cameras and different times of the previous 2 days. In the earliest clip, which was from 36 hours ago, it was moving along the northern ridge at midday, moving in the direction of the station. She had missed it because she had been reviewing the clips in order of camera rather than in order of timestamp, and this camera was one of the more distant ones. So it had been tracking the station for longer than she had thought. She went back to the window. Full daylight now, overcast but bright enough to see clearly. The wolves at the tree line were fully visible. They were resting, some lying down, some sitting upright, all facing the station. The pale wolf had moved back to the edge of the tree line, close to the others but still slightly apart, sitting upright, still watching. She counted 17. She had counted 12 in the pre-dawn light. There were now 17 visible, and the sun had been up for less than 2 hours. They were still arriving. She picked up her phone and texted Pete Cole. Packet station, growing in number. Currently 17 visible. Large pale animal present. I am inside and stable. Please advise on Gary's availability. Pete responded within minutes. Gary knows. He is briefing the corridor supervisor now. Recommends you stay put and do not initiate contact. Team meeting at District Station at 1400 if you can make it. She looked out the window at 17 wolves in the clearing and thought about whether she could make it to the District Station for a 2 o'clock meeting. The answer depended on whether the wolves allowed her vehicle to exit the clearing, which was a calculation she had never expected to need to make in the course of her professional life. She decided to make the meeting and see what happened. She packed her camera, her field notes, and her laptop into her work bag. She checked on Cinder, noted the cub's continued improvement, and made the difficult but necessary decision that Cinder would come with her. She could not leave the cub alone in the station for an unknown number of hours, and the wound, while improving, still required monitoring. She settled the cub into the small travel box she used for short wildlife transports, a padded, ventilated enclosure that she had on hand for exactly this kind of situation. Cinder accepted the travel box with less resistance than she had expected. The cub had been in unfamiliar situations continuously for 2 days now, and it seemed to have developed, if not comfort with that, at least some tolerance for it. She carried the travel box to her truck and secured it on the back seat. Then she stood beside the truck and looked at the 17 wolves between her and the road. They were watching her, all of them. The ones that had been lying down were sitting up now. The arrangement in the clearing had shifted subtly when she came outside, the wolves near the access road moving slightly to one side, in a way that could have been coincidence and could have been something else. She looked at the pale wolf. The pale wolf looked at her. It had not moved from its position near the tree line. It sat with the same composed, observational stillness it had maintained all morning, reading her the way she had been trained to read animals, without assumption, without projection, with the direct and open attention of something that was taking in information and making use of it. She got in the truck. She started the engine. She drove slowly toward the access road. The wolves parted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but as her truck moved forward, the animals in the path of the vehicle shifted, sideways, unhurried, without apparent alarm, opening a corridor just wide enough for the truck to pass through. She drove through it at 5 miles an hour, watching them in her mirrors, watching the way they closed behind her without urgency, watching the pale wolf at the edge of the group, which turned its head to follow her truck as she moved away, but did not follow. She drove down the access road toward the valley. She was shaking slightly, she noticed. Not badly. Not the uncontrolled shaking of fear, but the fine, residual tremor of adrenaline doing its work through a body that had been holding itself very still for a long time. She let it run its course. By the time she reached the main road, it was gone. She drove to the district station with Cinder quiet in the travel box on the back seat, and she thought about what she had just seen, and what it meant, and what was coming next. The meeting at 2 o'clock included Gary Marsh, the corridor's wildlife supervisor whose name was Louise Ferris, a compact woman in her 50s, with the kind of administrative efficiency that got things done without making noise, and Dale Overton, who turned out to be a man she had not yet met in person. Thin, medium height, dark-haired, with the careful, direct way of speaking that Gary had described on the phone. Overton listened to her account of the morning with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on her the entire time. When she finished, he asked exactly 4 questions: the height and approximate weight of the pale wolf, based on her observations, the number of wolves in the clearing when she left, the behavior of the wolves as her vehicle moved through the group, and the current location of the wolf cub. She answered all 4. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to share something with you. What I am about to tell you is part of an active federal investigation, and I am asking for your discretion." "Of course," she said. "The network that Phil Garrett operates as part of has been aware of a large, pale wolf in the northern section of this corridor for approximately 2 years. They have been attempting to locate it precisely for 14 months. They have a prospective buyer who has offered a sum of money for this animal that I am not going to state in this room, because the number is the kind of number that has a way of changing how people think about things." Louise Ferris said quietly, "That large?" "Yes," Overton said. "That large." He looked at Mara. "The wolf you have on your camera footage, the wolf that is currently sitting in a clearing surrounding your research station, with 16 other animals, that animal is at the center of the most significant wildlife trafficking investigation this region has seen in over a decade. And as of this morning, it is also, apparently, in direct contact with a federal wildlife researcher who has its young in her care." The room was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" Mara said. "Your cooperation and your judgment," Overton said. "Your footage, your behavioral observations, and, ideally, your continued presence in that station. Because right now, you are the only person in the world with a direct, documented connection to this animal." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the even, measuring expression of a man who had learned to read people the way she had learned to read animals, without assumption, without projection, with the direct and open attention of something that was taking in information and making use of it. She thought about the pale wolf at the window. She thought about the 17 animals in the clearing. She thought about Cinder in the travel box on the back seat of her truck. She thought about what it meant to be the only person in the world with a direct, documented connection to something that other people were willing to spend extraordinary amounts of money to take away. She thought about what it meant to be responsible for that. "All right," she said, "tell me what you need." The meeting went on for another hour and a half. By the time she drove back up the access road with Cinder on the back seat, and the afternoon light going gold on the ridge above her, she had given Dale Overton a copy of every camera trap clip she had taken since arriving at the station in September, had agreed to a daily check-in protocol with his team, and had accepted a small additional piece of equipment, a secondary communication device that operated on a different frequency than her standard radio, one that would reach Overton's team directly, regardless of signal conditions on the slope. She parked in the clearing and looked around. The wolves were gone. The clearing was empty and white and still, marked only by the tracks of 17 animals moving at the edges, a record in the snow of what had been there, already beginning to soften at the edges as the afternoon temperature edged slightly upward. She sat in the truck for a moment. Then she got out, retrieved Cinder from the back seat, carried the travel box inside, and settled the cub back into its regular box near the heater. She made herself dinner. It was past 6 and she had not eaten since early morning. She checked the cameras. She wrote in her field log. She went to the window one more time before she went to sleep. The clearing was empty. The tree line was still. The pale shapes of snow between the trees caught what little moonlight filtered through the clouds and held it, faintly, briefly, before the wind shifted and the clouds thickened and the night went fully dark. Whatever was out there was not visible, but it was there. She knew that the way she had come to know a great many things over her 6 years in the field, not through certainty, not through proof, but through the accumulated, irreplaceable knowledge of someone who had spent enough time in wild places to understand that the most important things were not always the ones you could see. She went to bed. She slept better than she expected. In the forest outside, in the deep and complex dark of the corridor, something pale moved between the trees in silence, and the forest arranged itself around it the way forests always arrange themselves around the things that belong to them, naturally, without effort, without question. 3 days after the wolves surrounded the station, Mara had developed a rhythm. She woke early, checked on Cinder, reviewed the previous night's camera footage, reported to Dale Overton's team on the secondary device, and spent the daylight hours working on her documentation in the station, while keeping one eye on the window. The wolves did not return in the daytime, but she had begun to understand that their absence during daylight hours did not mean they were not there. It meant they were somewhere else, doing what the pack needed to do, hunting, moving, maintaining the territorial patterns that kept 17 animals alive through a northern winter. But always, at some point in the dark hours, some of them came back. Not always in large numbers. Some nights it was 2 or 3 at the tree line. One night it was only one, a mid-sized gray, that sat at the north edge of the clearing for approximately 40 minutes, and then disappeared. But the pale wolf was always among them when they came, regardless of the number, and it was always in the same position, slightly apart, slightly forward, watching the station with that composed, unblinking attention that Mara had come to think of as the defining characteristic of the animal. Not patience exactly, something more active than patience. It was the quality of something that has made a decision, and is giving that decision the full weight of its attention. She had begun to feel, in a way she was careful not to write in her official field log, but that she noted in her personal notebook, that the pale wolf was not simply monitoring the situation, it was managing it. The 17 animals in the clearing that morning had not gathered randomly. They had arrived in an order, from directions that she had been able to trace from the camera footage, and that order had been consistent with the wolf that led from the front arriving first, and the wolves that flanked arriving in a sequence. It was organized, and the only thing that organized 17 wolves with that level of precision was a very specific kind of authority. She had looked up the research literature on wolf social structure again, more carefully than she had before, because she needed the rigorous scientific framing to contain what she was observing, without letting it slide into the kind of interpretation that a wildlife researcher did not allow herself. The literature was clear about the mechanisms of pack leadership and the behavioral signals that denoted hierarchical position, and what she was seeing outside her window was consistent with those mechanisms. The pale wolf was the dominant animal in a large, well-organized pack. That was the scientific description. The other description, the one she kept in the personal notebook, was that it was an animal that had been running the northern section of the corridor for a very long time, and that it was currently directing something that no researcher she had spoken to had a clear framework for, and that it had fixed her station, and the cub inside it, within a kind of protective attention that felt, whether or not this was the correct scientific term, like deliberate care. On the 4th morning, Pete Cole came back up the access road. He arrived at 7:15, parked at the edge of the clearing with the engine running for a moment before cutting it, and walked to the station door, with the careful, measured pace of someone who had been told not to make sudden movements. He had read the reports. He knew what might be watching. She let him in, and poured him coffee, and showed him the footage from the previous 3 nights. He watched without speaking, which she appreciated. There was a kind of respect in watching field footage, without immediately reaching for explanations, and Pete had it. He watched each clip through completely, without skipping forward, and when the last one ended, he sat back and held his coffee cup in both hands, and looked at the floor for a moment. "The number is growing," he said. "Yes. 3 nights ago it was 12. 2 nights ago it was 15, last night it was 19. Yes." He looked up. "Where are they coming from?" "Based on the camera positions and the directions of approach, I think they are coming from the northern section. Beyond the ridge, there may be a secondary pack, or a group that does not typically operate in this part of the corridor, that is being drawn south." "By what?" She looked at him. He understood the implication immediately. "The Pale Wolf," he said. "I believe so." He was quiet for another moment. "Mara, 19 wolves is not a pack. It is 2 or 3 packs combined." "I know. That doesn't happen." "I know." He looked out the window. The clearing was empty in the morning light, the tracks of the previous night already partially softened by a light overnight snowfall. Nothing moved at the tree line. The pines stood in their rows, giving nothing away. "What does Overton say?" "He says it is unprecedented in his professional experience, and that his team is monitoring the camera data I am sending them and developing a response." "What kind of response?" "He has not specified." Pete looked back at her. There was something in his expression she recognized as the particular unease of someone who is trying to reconcile what they have been trained to expect with what they are actually seeing. She had felt that same unease for the past 4 days. She had learned to work with it rather than against it. "The Pale Wolf at the window," he said. "The first night, you didn't wake up. You felt something shift, and then you woke up." "Yes. That's not scientific language." "No," she said. "It is not." He nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He did not try to turn what she had said into something more comfortable than what it was. She was starting to think that Pete Cole was going to be a very good wildlife officer. He stayed for 2 hours, reviewing the footage with her and helping her update the behavioral log with data from the nighttime cameras she had not yet had time to cross-reference. He was systematic and thorough. He asked precise questions. Before he left, he stood at the window for a long moment, looking at the tree line. "Gary wants me to tell you something," he said, "off the record." "All right." "He says if you need to come out, come out. He says the protocol and the investigation are important, but they are not worth your safety." "Tell him I understand." "He also says—" Pete stopped, started again. "He says he has been doing this work for 30 years, and he has never seen anything like what you are describing. And he wants you to know that he believes you." She looked at him. "Thank you, Pete." He left. She stood at the window after his truck disappeared down the access road, and thought about what it meant to be believed. It was not a word that usually needed to be said, in the context of professional field research. You documented what you saw. Other people read the documentation and drew conclusions. Whether they believed the researcher was a question that existed in the space between the data and the person reading it, and it was usually a clean space, without much ambiguity. This was not that situation. She went back to the window that evening, at the time the wolves usually began to arrive, which had become, over 4 nights of observation, approximately 40 minutes after sunset. She was there, watching, when the first shape appeared at the north tree line, then the second. By the time full dark had settled over the clearing, she had counted 22. 22 wolves in the ring around her station. She recorded the count in her field log and relayed it to Overton's team on the secondary device. The response from his team was a single word: acknowledged. She was used to that. Overton's people did not add commentary to operational communications. They recorded what she sent and integrated it into whatever larger picture they were building, and she trusted, because she had to trust, that the picture they were building was a good one. The Pale Wolf was in its position, open ground, south side of the clearing, slightly forward of the tree line. It had arrived exactly when she expected it to, from the expected direction, and it had moved into the expected position, and then it had stopped and looked at the station and not moved again. She spent 2 hours watching it that night. She was learning to read it the way she learned to read any animal over extended observation, by accumulating detail until the detail started to resolve into something coherent. The Pale Wolf's body language was controlled in a way that suggested considerable experience with precisely that control. Its tail, which she could see clearly in the camera footage if not always through the window, rarely moved. Its ears adjusted constantly, reading the sound environment of the forest, but its head was almost always oriented toward the station. Its breathing was visible in the cold air, as small pale puffs that appeared and disappeared in the dark with complete regularity. She thought about regularity, about an animal that maintained that level of composed, focused presence in cold temperatures for hours, across multiple nights, returning night after night to the same position, waiting with the same quality of attention. She thought about what that required. Not strength exactly, though the animal clearly had that. Something more internal. The kind of resolve that came from certainty about why you were doing something, even when doing it was difficult. She thought about that for a long time. At midnight, something different happened. The wolves at the tree line, all 22 of them, went simultaneously still. The small movements, the occasional shift of weight, the brief turn of a head, the minimal adjustments of resting animals, stopped all at once, as if a current had passed through the group. Every head came up, every body oriented in the same direction. Northeast. She looked northeast. Nothing visible in the camera that covered that quadrant. The camera recorded the footage anyway, triggered by the motion of the wolves themselves, and she watched the northeastern tree line through the window, with the particular sharpened attention of someone watching a situation move from stable to active. Then she heard the engine. It was faint, far away, coming from the direction of the old service road that ran along the northeastern boundary of the corridor, a road that was not on any public map, and that she had only learned about from a detailed survey document Gary Marsh had given her in the first month of her assignment. It was not the Devlin logging road. It was older than that, barely maintained, accessible in winter, only to vehicles with very high clearance. The kind of vehicle that Phil Garrett drove. She reached for the secondary communication device without taking her eyes off the northeastern tree line. "This is Callaway at station," she said. "Engine sound, northeastern boundary, approximately midnight. Not on the public access road. Possible service road approach." The response came within 30 seconds. "Confirmed. Tracking. 2 vehicles picked up on aerial drone 15 minutes ago. Northeastern approach. Stay inside. Do not exit the station." She put the device down. She looked at the 22 wolves in the clearing. They were all still facing northeast. The pale wolf had turned its body to face the same direction. All 22 animals, arranged in a ring around her station, were now oriented toward the sound of the approaching engines. She had read, in her research into wolf behavior, about the concept of territorial defense. Wolves defended their territory actively, consistently, and with considerable sophistication. They communicated threat and boundary information across the pack, with efficiency that researchers had spent decades trying to fully map. A large, established pack, defending established territory, was one of the most effective natural security systems in existence. She had read that. She understood it intellectually. She had documented it in other contexts over the course of her career. She had never, until this moment, stood inside the thing that a large pack was defending. The engines grew slightly louder, then stopped. Cut off, she thought. Whoever it was, they had turned off the engines. They were continuing on foot. The wolves did not move. She called Overton directly. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting her call. "I hear them," she said. "They are on foot now." "I know. We have 2 officers moving in from the south access. They will be approximately 18 minutes out." A pause. Mara. The wolves. 22. Fully alert. Facing the northeastern approach. Another pause, longer this time. "All right, stay on the line." She stayed on the line. She stood at the window and watched the ring of animals in the dark clearing, and listened to the forest, and thought about 18 minutes, and what 18 minutes meant. She thought about what Overton had said in the meeting at the district station. The sum he had not stated in the room. The 14 months of attempts to locate the pale wolf precisely. The buyer who was waiting for something that had, for 7 years, refused to be found. She thought about Phil Garrett's expression in the clearing 3 days ago. That measuring, calculating composure. A man who was patient, because he had learned that patience was more effective than urgency, and who was very good at what he did. And she thought about the pale wolf, standing in the open ground of the clearing, with its body oriented northeast, still and composed and completely alert, reading the sound of 2 vehicles and a group of people moving through the forest in the dark. She thought, It knows. Not in the way a human being processed information and drew conclusions, but in the way a large, highly intelligent animal with 7 years of experience in this specific territory processed the information available to it, the sounds, the scents, the behavior of the rest of the pack, and made a precise assessment of what was happening. It knew. Mara, Overton's voice on the device. Movement at the northeastern tree line. My drone has 4 individuals on foot, approximately 300 yards from the clearing. I see nothing yet. They will be in your camera range in approximately 4 minutes. She looked at the 22 wolves, still facing northeast. The pale wolf had not moved from its forward position, but she noticed, watching carefully, that the wolves at the edges of the ring, the ones on the northeastern arc, had shifted slightly inward, tightening the gap. Overton, she said. Yes. The pack is repositioning, northeastern arc contracting. A long pause. Contracting how? The animals on the northeastern side of the ring are reducing the gap between themselves and the tree line. They are moving closer to the northeastern approach, closing the perimeter. That is what it looks like. The pause was longer this time. When Overton spoke again, his voice was very controlled. My officers are now 12 minutes out. Do you have a secure position inside the station? She looked around the cabin. 1 door, reinforced but not impenetrable. 4 windows, each with a basic lock. The station had been designed as a remote research facility, not as a fortified position. Reasonably secure, she said. Reasonably is going to have to do for 12 minutes. I know. Keep the line open. She kept the line open. She went to the window. The northeastern tree line was still and dark and gave nothing visible away. She watched her camera monitor, the small screen mounted on the wall that displayed the northeastern camera feed, and at 3 minutes 40 seconds, she saw them. 4 figures moving through the trees in single file. Dark clothing. Slow, careful movement. The lead figure carried something that was too dark and too small to be a firearm, and too narrow to be a standard piece of equipment. She thought, from the shape, that it might be a sight of some kind, the kind used for tracking in low-light conditions. They were looking at the clearing. They were looking at the wolves. And then, she watched it happen on the screen. They stopped. All 4 of them. Stopped in the trees, approximately 150 feet from the edge of the clearing. The lead figure held up a hand, and they all became still. They had seen the wolves. She looked back out the window at the pack. The pack had seen them too. The 22 wolves were fully oriented now, every body in the ring facing the northeastern trees, every head up, every ear forward. The pale wolf in the clearing center had turned as well, and as Mara watched, it did something she had not seen it do before. In 3 nights of observation and hours of camera footage, it raised its head, and it held it there. Not a howl. Not yet. Just the raised head, the open posture, the full physical statement of an animal making itself seen, fully seen, not hiding, not retreating, not deferring, standing in the open ground in the dark and letting itself be as visible as it could possibly be to the things in the trees. The 4 figures in the northeastern tree line did not move. The pale wolf held its position, and the 10 minutes until Overton's officers arrived were the longest 10 minutes Mara Calloway had ever spent at a window. Overton's officers arrived in 9 minutes and 40 seconds, which Mara knew because she counted. They came from the south, as Overton had said they would, moving into the clearing in a way that was practiced and precise. 2 figures, not running but covering ground quickly, with the low-profile movement of people trained to arrive without announcing themselves to anyone other than the person they were arriving to help. She had the station door open before they reached it. One was a woman in her 30s named Carla Devane, who had the steady, focused look of someone fully inside her professional role. The other was a man named Alan Birch, somewhat older, who nodded to Mara once and immediately moved to the northeastern window and looked out. "Still there," she said. "Still there," he confirmed, looking at the camera monitor. The 4 figures in the northeastern trees had not moved. They were deeper in the trees than they had been. They had taken at least a few steps back when Overton's officers entered the clearing, but they were still there. "The pack?" Carla Devane said. "Still in position." She looked at the screen, at the ring of 22 animals in the clearing, and her face did not change expression in any obvious way. But something behind her eyes shifted in a manner that Mara had come to recognize as the expression of a person recalibrating what they thought they knew. "That is a lot of wolves," Devane said. "Yes," Mara said. "It is." Overton's voice came through the secondary device. "What is your status?" Alan Birch answered. "On location. Subjects holding position in northeastern tree line, approximately 150 from clearing edge. Pack is present and stationary. Confirmed. Additional officers are coming in from the northwestern boundary to cut off the retreat route. Hold position. Do not engage the subjects yet." "Understood." Mara looked at Devane. "He wants them on record doing something actionable." "He always does," Devane said, not disapprovingly. "It's why the cases hold." They waited. The next 35 minutes were quiet in the station, and not quiet outside it. Through the camera monitor, Mara watched the four figures in the northeastern trees make small adjustments, moving slightly, consulting with each other. At one point, one of them moving back in the direction they had come from before returning. She could not hear what they were saying. She could see the shapes of them and the way they held themselves, and what she read from their body language was the particular quality of a group that has encountered an obstacle they did not anticipate and are figuring out what to do about it. The obstacle was 22 wolves. She had seen Garrett's people operate twice now. She had seen them on the Devlin logging road, where they had been stopped by Gary Marsh's officers, and she had seen them in the clearing 3 days ago, where Garrett himself had stood with that calculating patience while his situation was being assessed. Both times, she had read in them the efficiency of people who did things regularly and expected to face predictable obstacles and deal with them. The wolves were not a predictable obstacle. She thought about what that meant, and she thought about the pale wolf holding its ground in the open clearing, and she thought about the systematic way the northeastern arc of the pack had tightened when the figures entered the trees, and she found that she was not afraid in the way she had expected to be afraid during a situation like this one. She was alert, she was watching everything. But beneath the alertness was something that was not quite calm, and not quite confidence, but functioned like both of them, the quality that came from trusting what was in the clearing. "The large pale one," Alan Birch said, looking at the screen. "It hasn't moved." "No," Mara said. "Since you have been watching it, does it move when it doesn't need to?" She thought about it. "Rarely," she said. He nodded. He went back to watching. Overton's voice again. "Northwestern team is in position. Eastern approach is covered. On my signal." A pause. "Mara." "Yes. When this is over, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "I need you to stay completely still. Whatever happens in that clearing in the next few minutes, stay inside, stay still, and let my people handle it." She looked at Cinder in the box near the heater. The cub was upright and still, oriented toward the door with an attention that mirrored, in its small way, the quality she had been watching in the pale wolf for 4 nights. "I understand," she said. "Good." The signal came at 12:47 in the morning. She heard it rather than saw it. Voices from the northwestern direction, firm and clear, the particular commanding cadence of law enforcement officers identifying themselves. Then voices from the eastern direction doing the same. The northeastern tree line, which had been still for the past 20 minutes, became suddenly active. The 4 figures began to move, and the direction they moved was toward the clearing, which was not a retreat so much as the movement of a group trying to find an opening that had just closed on multiple sides. They broke from the trees into the edge of the clearing, and they stopped. In front of them, between them and any route that crossed the clearing, were 22 wolves. Mara watched it through the window and the camera monitor simultaneously, switching her attention between them to capture the full picture. The 4 men were in a loose, instinctive cluster at the clearing edge, the way people clustered when they encountered something unexpected and large. She could see their faces now, in the camera's low-light resolution. She recognized 2 of them from the logging road. The others were faces she had not seen before. The pale wolf had not moved. It was still in the center of the clearing, still oriented northeast, and now the men at the clearing edge were looking directly at it from a distance of perhaps 40 feet. None of the 22 wolves made a sound. That was the part she had not expected. She had anticipated howling, the full-throated territorial challenge that researchers documented when packs encountered threats. But there was nothing. Just the absolute complete silence of 22 large animals holding position in a ring, with the largest of them in the center, and open ground between it and the four people who had been moving through the dark trying to take something that was not theirs. The silence was considerably more effective than noise would have been. One of the men took a single step forward into the clearing, testing something, and the wolves at the northeastern arc of the ring shifted, not retreating, not advancing, just a collective, simultaneous adjustment of position that reduced the gap between them and the man by approximately 2 feet. Not a charge, not even an approach. Just a demonstration of the fact that the gap could be reduced. The man stopped. Overton's officers moved out of the tree lines on the western and eastern sides of the clearing, and suddenly there were 4 federal wildlife officers in bright jackets with the kinds of credentials that made the next series of events considerably more straightforward. The 4 men in the clearing were identified, documented, and taken to vehicles on the northwestern service road where Mara had heard the original engines. The process was efficient and professional and took less than 12 minutes. During all 12 minutes, the 22 wolves did not move. When the officers and the 4 men were gone from the clearing, the wolf nearest the northern tree line turned first and walked back into the trees. Then another, then a third. Within 5 minutes, the clearing was empty again. All 22 of them, gone into the dark forest as smoothly as they had arrived, leaving nothing behind but tracks in the snow. The pale wolf went last. She watched it through the window. It stood in the open clearing for approximately 30 seconds after the last of the others had moved into the trees. It was facing the station, the same composed, steady attention it had maintained for 4 nights, pointed directly at her window, exactly as it had been pointed the first night she had looked out and seen eyes in the dark. Then it turned and walked into the trees, and the clearing was empty. Mara stood at the window for a long time after it was gone. Devane and Birch were talking on their devices, reporting to Overton, confirming the status of the people in custody and the current situation at the station. Their voices were professional and efficient and carried the particular quality of people finishing a job they had started. She listened to them without really hearing them. She was looking at the tracks the wolves had left in the snow, the marks of 22 animals moving in and out of the same clearing over 4 nights, the evidence of something that had no precedent in any field report she had ever read. Overton called her directly 10 minutes later. 4 in custody, he said. 2 of them are people we have been looking for a considerable time. This is a significant outcome. Good, she said. Garrett was not among them. She had expected that. He would not come in person tonight. Not after what happened 3 days ago in the clearing. He would know the station was being watched. Yes, we believe the same. But the 2 individuals we have are people who will help us get to him. A pause. Mara, what I watched happen in that clearing tonight. Yes. I have been doing this for 19 years. I have worked wildlife crime cases on 4 continents. I have never seen anything like that. No, she said. I don't expect you have. Are you all right? She thought about the question honestly. Her legs were slightly unsteady. Her hands were warm, from holding the secondary device for so long, and when she set it down, her fingers felt stiff from the grip. Her heart rate, which she had been keeping steady through careful breath control, was now doing the work of settling back to normal, which meant she had been operating at a higher level than she had fully registered during the event. I am fine, she said. I need to sleep. Yes, Overton said. You do. Devane and Birch will stay until morning. She accepted this without argument. She went to the box near the heater and looked at Cinder for a long time. The cub was looking back at her with those bright, clear eyes that had gone from terrified to cautious to something approaching familiar over the 4 days they had spent together. Its leg, she noted, was continuing to heal. It was bearing more weight on it than it had the day before. She put her hand into the box. Cinder touched its nose to her fingers. Then it settled itself back down and closed its eyes. She sat on the floor next to the box and put her back against the wall, the way she had on the first night, and listened to Devane and Birch move quietly around the station, making their last reports of the evening, and listened to the wind outside, and listened to the particular quality of a night that had been full of things and was now emptying itself out. She slept there, on the floor, for 4 hours. Deep and complete sleep, the kind that came from a body that had burned through everything it had and needed to be replenished from the ground up. She woke at 4:45. Devane was at the window. Outside, the clearing was quiet and dark, and the only tracks in the snow were the ones that had already been there. Nothing had moved since the wolves left. Anything? Mara said. Nothing, Devane said. Quiet all night. Mara got up and went to the window and stood beside her and looked at the clearing. The darkness was beginning, just barely, to thin at the eastern edge, the very first suggestion of a dawn that was still more than an hour away. What happens next? Devane said. It was a genuine question, Mara could tell. Not procedural, not about the investigation. Something more like what Mara herself had been wondering. I'm going to return the cub, Mara said. Devane looked at her. The cub is healed enough. The pack is present. The situation. She stopped, started again. The situation has been what it has been, because I have the cub. Returning the cub is the right thing to do. It has always been the right thing to do. I was waiting for the right moment. And the moment is now? The moment is this morning, Mara said. Yes. Devane looked at the clearing again. Will you go alone? Yes. Devane was quiet. Then she said, all right. It was not approval, exactly, and it was not permission, because Devane had no authority to grant or deny either. It was something simpler. The acknowledgement of one person who worked in difficult situations toward another, that some things were done by the person who had earned the right to do them, and no one else. Mara turned away from the window. She went to begin the work of preparing. The plan she had been building in her mind over the past 4 days was not complicated. Its simplicity was the point. The kind of moments that mattered were almost always structurally simple. They required not elaborate preparation but clear thinking, because clear thinking in a simple situation was harder than it sounded, and because the things that could go wrong in a simple situation were not predictable in the way the things that could go wrong in a complicated one were. She knew what she was going to do. She was going to carry Cinder into the clearing. She was going to put the cub down. She was going to step back. And she was going to trust, not blindly, not without basis, but with the specific, earned trust of someone who had spent 4 nights watching an animal hold its position and make its choices, that what came next was what was supposed to come next. She went to Cinder's box and knelt beside it. The cub looked at her. In the dim light of the station, those eyes were as clear and steady as they had been on the first morning, when she had looked down at the box and seen an animal that was beginning to reclaim itself from fear. They were steadier now, calmer, the eyes of something that had been through a difficult passage and had come out the other side of it intact. Good morning, she said. Cinder put its nose against her hand. We are going to fix this, she said. Today. She stood up and went to look out the window one more time. The clearing was still dark, but the darkness was thinning now. In another 40 minutes, it would be light enough to see clearly across the full span of the clearing. In another 40 minutes, what needed to happen could happen in the light, which was better, because the things that happened in the light were the things that could be remembered accurately. She looked at the tree line. Nothing there yet, nothing visible. But the pale wolf had come every night for 4 nights, and it had arrived in the same way, early, from the same direction, before the others. And this morning, she thought, it would come early again, and when it arrived, she would be ready. She sat at her desk and watched the darkness thin. She watched the first light come, and she waited. The pale wolf arrived at 6:22 in the morning. She saw it at the southern tree line first, the way she always did, a shape in the dark border between forest and clearing that was too large and too still to be anything other than what it was. It had been there for at least a minute before she noticed it, which told her it had moved into position with the same soundless efficiency it always employed, and that it had not hurried. It had simply arrived, the way gravity arrives, without announcement, already in place when you looked. She was dressed. She had been dressed since 4:30, standing at the window in her full outdoor layers, with the secondary communication device in her pocket, and her hand near the handle of the travel box, where Cinder sat, awake and alert, nose working the air that came through the station's seals. Devane was behind her, near the door. Alan Birch was at the northern window. Neither of them spoke. Mara looked at the pale wolf for 2 full minutes. It was looking at the station. The quality of its attention, even in the dim pre-dawn light, was unmistakable. That full, focused, composed regard that she had been watching for 4 nights, and that she had come to understand as the primary expression of an animal that had learned, over many years, to make its decisions carefully, and then commit to them completely. She looked for the others. They were there, coming in from the expected directions, settling into the ring formation she had come to know well, but slower this morning, more spread out, as though they understood, in the way that animals understood the mood of a situation, without needing to be told, that this morning was different from the previous nights. She counted 12 before she stopped counting. 12 was enough. "I am going out," she said quietly. She heard Devane shift slightly. No one said anything. That was right. She picked up the travel box. Cinder made no sound inside it. She could feel the cub's weight shifting as it adjusted its position, the small movements of an animal that was paying full attention to everything around it. She went to the door. She opened it. The cold came in at once, sharp and complete, the kind of cold that crystallized the air inside your nostrils with the first breath. She stepped through the door and pulled it mostly closed behind her. Not fully. She needed it to be possible to retreat quickly if she had to, and a fully closed door required a handle turn that took 2 seconds she might not have, but far enough closed to give the air outside a chance to feel uncontained and open. The clearing was quiet. She stood on the step for a moment and let the wolves see her, let them read her. She had learned, from her years in the field, that wild animals needed a moment to adjust to your presence, not because they were slow, but because they were careful, and careful required information, and information required time. She stood still on the step and gave them the time. The pale wolf did not move. She stepped off the step and into the clearing. Her boots crunched once on the frozen surface of the snow, and then found quieter purchase as she slowed her pace. She walked steadily toward the center of the clearing, where the pale wolf stood 30 feet away, and she kept her breathing even, and her shoulders down, and her eyes forward, without being aggressive about it, the same body language she had been using for 4 nights through a pane of glass. The wolves at the ring held position. She was 10 feet from the pale wolf when she stopped and crouched. The wolf was large. She had known this from the footage, from the camera measurements, from the professional assessment she had made over 4 days of careful observation. But knowing it from footage, and being in the same 10-foot radius of open air, was different. The animal was not simply large in the way that some wolves were large. It was large in a way that suggested the upper boundaries of what the species was capable of. Thick through the chest, high at the shoulder, with a head that carried the full, broad structure of an animal in its prime. Its coat, in the pre-dawn light, was a pale silver gray that was almost white along the shoulders and face. Its eyes, looking directly at her from 10 feet away, were a light amber that seemed to gather the faint pre-dawn light and hold it. She had looked at thousands of wolves in her career. She had been in the presence of many of them in the field. She had never been this close to anything quite like this. She held the travel box in both hands. She set it on the snow. She opened the latch on the front panel. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then Cinder pushed the front panel open and stepped out into the snow. The cub stood for a moment in the circle of the open travel box, nose working furiously, taking in the cold air and everything it carried. The smell of the forest, the smell of the snow, the smell of the wolves around the ring, and the smell, close and immediate and completely specific, of the animal, 10 feet in front of it. The pale wolf lowered its head. Cinder took a step forward, the leg held, a slight adjustment in the gait, still present but barely, the residual memory of the wound rather than the wound itself. The cub was walking, and walking correctly, and it covered the 10 feet between the travel box and the pale wolf in a series of small, slightly uneven steps that ended with its face pressed against the wolf's chest. Mara did not move. The pale wolf put its chin on top of the cub's back. The sound the cub made was quiet, small, private, the kind of sound that existed only between 2 specific creatures, neither seeking an audience nor needing one. Mara heard it from her crouched position in the snow and felt, in her chest, the sensation of a tension she had been carrying for 5 days, releasing all at once. She stayed crouched for a full minute. Then she stood up, slowly. She picked up the empty travel box. She stepped backward 3 paces, toward the station, and she watched. The pale wolf raised its head. It looked at her. She had spent 5 days trying to understand this animal, through camera footage, and window glass, and professional training, and every piece of scientific language she had available. She had called it a dominant animal, an apex predator, an undocumented specimen of extraordinary size. All of those were accurate. All of them were also inadequate. What she saw when it looked at her, from a distance of 13 feet, in the pale light of a dawn that was just beginning to color the eastern sky above the ridge, was something she did not have a precise scientific term for. She had thought about this in advance, and she had decided that the absence of a precise term was the term, that there were things in the world that existed at the edge of language, that could be fully seen and fully experienced, and never fully said, and that the right response to such things was not to reach for inadequate words, but to simply stand in them and let them be what they were. She stood. The pale wolf looked at her for 5 seconds. She counted them. Then it turned, slowly and without urgency, and walked toward the tree line. Cinder fell into step beside it, matching the larger animal's pace as best it could, small and slightly uneven beside that massive, unhurried form. At the edge of the tree line, the pale wolf stopped once. It did not look back at the station, but it paused, just for a moment, in the space between the clearing and the forest, where the morning light met the dark of the trees. Then it stepped through. Cinder stepped through after it. The trees were still. Mara stood in the clearing until she was certain they were not coming back. Not because she wanted them to, but because the moment required completion, and completion required staying in it long enough to feel it close. She stood for 3 minutes. She listened to the forest begin its morning activity, the first bird calls, faint and distant, the particular quality of sound that a corridor in winter had in the hour after dawn, when the cold was still sharp, but the light had begun its work. She turned and walked back to the station. Devane held the door open. Inside, Alan Birch was on his device, relaying something in the quiet, efficient language of a professional completing a report. The station was warm. The empty box was near the heater, and the absence of the cub inside it was a shape that Mara felt distinctly, not as loss, but as completion. She sat down at her desk. She did not reach for her field log. Not yet. There would be time for the official documentation, the careful and precise language that turned experience into record. Right now, she needed a few minutes that were not official. She put her hands flat on the desk and looked at them. Her fingers were cold from the 30 minutes outside. She had not noticed the cold while she was in it. She noticed it now. Devane brought her coffee. She accepted it without speaking. She drank it and let the warmth work its way down through her, and thought about nothing in particular, and about everything at once, which was sometimes the same thing. Overton called at 6:58. She told him what had happened. She told him in the precise, sequential language she used for field reports, covering the time of departure from the station, the position of the wolves, the approach, the release, and the withdrawal of the pack. She did not include the 5 seconds the pale wolf had looked at her. Some things were in the record, and some things were not, and the difference between them was not always clarity. "The cub is with the pack," she said. "Yes," Overton said. "The pack has withdrawn. The clearing is empty." "Yes." A silence. Then Overton said, "Garrett was arrested at 5:40 this morning, at a property 60 miles east of the corridor. Our eastern team." A pause. "He was in the process of preparing to move, based on what we found at the property. But he did not move in time." She absorbed this. "How long until the charges are confirmed?" "The arrest is confirmed. The charges are being finalized today and tomorrow. The federal prosecutor has been briefed and considers the case strong." Another pause. "Mara, what you have given this investigation over the past 5 days, the footage, the behavioral data, the direct account, is going to be significant. I know. Are you all right?" She had been asked this question more times in the past week than in the previous year combined. She supposed it was the kind of question a situation like this generated. She was not annoyed by it. It was a reasonable question. "Yes," she said. "I am. I need to write up the morning's events while they are fresh." "Of course," Overton said. "We will talk tomorrow." She ended the call. She looked at her field log. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date and the time. Then she wrote, "Cub released to pack at approximately 06:30 hours. Pack present in clearing formation. 12 animals. Large pale wolf, dominant animal. Received cub directly. Cub appeared to recognize the dominant animal. Injury to left foreleg, assessed as sufficiently healed for movement. Cub mobile, bearing full weight on affected leg. Pack withdrew immediately, following cub transfer. No aggressive behavior observed at any point during the transfer." She paused. Then she wrote one more line, "Transfer completed without incident." She read it back. Then she closed the notebook. Devane was packing her equipment. Birch had finished his call and was checking the window out of professional habit, the final sweep of a person about to leave a location. The station was going back to being only the station, not a command post, not a protected position, just a converted ranger cabin in a federally protected wildlife corridor, where a field researcher lived and worked and paid attention to what the forest was doing. She looked at the empty box near the heater. She had named the cub Cinder because it was gray as ash and had come out of the cold and the dark. She had not expected to have the animal long enough for the name to matter. Names were not something you gave to wild animals you intended to return to the wild, because names created attachment, and attachment complicated the work. She knew this. She had not been thinking clearly about protocol on a frozen hillside at 9 in the evening when she gave the cub a name. But the name had mattered anyway. Names generally did. She picked up the empty box and folded it flat. She carried it to the storage area at the back of the station and put it on a shelf with the other folded boxes and the extra equipment that accumulated in field stations over months of work. She found a place for it between a spare camera housing and a coil of data cable, and she pushed it in until it sat level on the shelf. Then she turned and walked back to her desk. She had a camera trap to check on the eastern slope. She had 2 pages of behavioral observations to complete from the previous week's footage. She had the daily check-in with Overton's team to prepare for, and a long report to write for Dr. Price, covering everything that had happened since she had last submitted formal documentation 2 weeks ago, which had been before any of this had occurred, and which now felt like a report about a different assignment in a different world. She put her jacket on. She checked the laces on her boots. She went outside into the morning, which was cold and bright and completely ordinary on its surface, the way mornings in the northern Rockies were ordinary. The trees in their rows, the clearing in its white expanse, the ridge above catching the first real light and holding it in that way it had, that made the snow line look like something that was glowing from inside. She walked to the tree line where the tracks were still visible in the snow, the marks of 12 wolves moving in and out, and she stood there and looked at them for a moment. The track of the pale wolf was easy to identify by size, the paw prints deep and wide and evenly spaced. And beside the large track, slightly offset, the smaller track of a cub that was slightly favoring its left front, but walking with increasing confidence, walking back into the world it had been born into. She looked at those tracks for a long time. Then she turned south and began the walk to the eastern slope, and the clearing was behind her, and the forest was ahead of her, and the day was beginning in the way that days in wild places began, without ceremony, without announcement, just light and cold, and the work of being alive in a complicated and particular world. She walked. Above her, on the ridge, the sunlight was spreading. And somewhere in the northern section of the corridor, in the forest that she had been studying for 3 months, and would spend the next 3 months studying, and would probably spend the better part of her professional life trying to fully understand, 12 wolves were moving through their morning territory with the fluid, ground-covering efficiency of animals that had been doing this long before anyone was watching, and intended to continue long after the watching was done. One of them was small and slightly gray, with a cream patch beneath its chin, and a leg that was healing cleanly. It moved beside the largest of the 12, not behind it, not following it, but beside it, close enough to touch, far enough to have its own ground. The morning went on. The forest went on. The work of living in a wild and complicated world went on. And Mara Calloway went on too, walking east along the slope toward the camera trap, writing in her head the language she would use to describe what had happened, looking for the precise and honest words that would carry the facts of these 5 days forward, into the record where they needed to go, so that other people in other situations could find them, and know that something like this had happened once, in the northern Rockies, in late November, when a researcher picked up a wounded cub and a pale wolf that no one had ever properly documented, decided that this was something worth paying attention to. She found some of the words. She would find the rest later. She always did. The official charges were filed 6 weeks after Dale Overton's team completed its initial phase of evidence collection. The charges covered 11 individuals across 3 states, and included offenses related to wildlife trafficking, illegal possession of protected species, illegal trapping in federal wilderness areas, and several additional counts that Mara's attorney, a wildlife law specialist named Carol Dean, who had been recommended by Dr. Price, explained to her, in a conference call, that lasted 90 minutes and covered considerably more legal detail than she had been prepared for. She listened carefully and asked careful questions and wrote down the important points in her field notebook, which was the same notebook she always used for everything, because she had never been the kind of person who kept separate notebooks for separate areas of her life. 3 of the 11 men were those who had come to her station. 2 of them were from the original group on the Devlin logging road. The third was Phil Garrett, who had organized the second visit with the larger group and the transport vehicle, and who turned out to have been coordinating wildlife capture operations in the Northern Rockies for nearly 4 years. Garrett was not the top of the chain, as Overton had said, but he was close enough to it that his arrest and his subsequent decision to cooperate with investigators opened up parts of the network that had been sealed for years. Mara gave testimony twice, once in a formal interview with federal investigators, once in a preliminary hearing that Carol Dean said was likely to be followed by a full trial sometime in the spring. Both times, she spoke the same way she always spoke, carefully, specifically, without drama, and without leaving out the parts that were complicated, because complicated parts were where the important information usually lived. In the middle of all of this, she went back to the station. Dr. Price had offered to send someone else. She had declined. The research was hers, and the station was her assignment, and the corridor was where she needed to be. She drove back up the access road on a morning in mid-January, when the temperature was -8, and the road was iced but passable, and she unlocked the station door and stepped inside and stood in the main room for a moment. It smelled of cold and old wood, and the particular quality of air in a space that had been closed and undisturbed for several weeks. She opened the heating unit and let it run while she unpacked her bags and reorganized her supplies and replaced the things she had used. She set up her desk the way she always had it. She checked her camera trap connections and found 3 of the 6 offline, batteries dead, which she had anticipated and addressed with fresh batteries in her pack. She made coffee. She went to the window. The clearing was smooth and white and undisturbed. The tree line stood as it always did, dark and still and giving nothing away. There was nothing visible at the edges of the trees. She stayed at the window for a while anyway. Over the following 2 weeks, she rebuilt her documentation. The camera traps, once their batteries were restored, had weeks of footage she had not yet reviewed. She worked through it systematically, the way she always did. She logged deer and fox and rabbit and a family of river otters that had no business being this far from water, but seemed content with their choices. She logged elk twice, a small group moving through the valley below the ridge. She logged birds, the particular birds of winter, the ones that stayed when everything else left. And on the 14th night after she returned, the motion sensor on camera trap 3 triggered at 2:47 in the morning. She reviewed the footage the next morning. The camera had been positioned on the high point of the ridge, looking down into the valley. The timestamp said 2:47, and the footage was 40 seconds long, which meant the motion had continued for longer than the standard 30-second burst, triggering an extension. She pressed play. A wolf moved through the frame, gray, medium-sized, moving at a steady pace along the lower edge of the valley. Behind it, another wolf. Then 3 more. They moved in the loose, efficient formation she had documented before, the lead animal breaking trail, the others pacing themselves in its track. She counted 6 in the frame before the footage ended. She looked at the timestamp on the next clip. 3:41 in the morning. Camera trap 1, on the eastern slope. 1 wolf, alone, moving east. Smaller than the others, moving carefully, with a slight adjustment in its gait on the left front leg that was barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. She watched the clip twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she got up and refilled her coffee and came back to the desk and wrote in her field log, Camera trap 1, 3:41 hours. Single juvenile wolf, moving east through eastern slope path. Slight residual adjustment in left foreleg gait. Animal in good health. No signs of distress. Moving with apparent purpose and familiarity with terrain. She paused. Then she added, identified as likely Cinder, based on gait pattern and size relative to other pack members visible in prior footage. Animal fully integrated into pack movement. No behavioral indicators of habituation to human presence. She read it back, then she saved the file. She got up and walked to the window and looked out at the clearing. The morning was bright and cold, and the snow in the clearing was marked with the overnight tracks of a deer that had crossed from east to west at some point in the dark. The tree line was still. The sky above the ridge was pale blue, the color it turned when the air was very cold and very clear, the particular blue that meant good visibility and sharp temperatures and a day that would be beautiful in the way that difficult things sometimes were. She stood at the window for a while. She thought about the past 2 months. She thought about the night she had found Cinder under the fallen spruce. She thought about Gary Marsh and Dale Overton and Carol Dean and Dr. Price. She thought about the 11 men who were facing charges and the buyers whose names she still did not know, and the long, slow work of legal proceedings that would go on for months and possibly years. She thought about the clearing before dawn and the pale wolf standing in the open snow and the moment Cinder walked across the white ground toward it. Then she stopped thinking about all of that and started thinking about what she needed to do today. She had 3 camera traps to check and 2 pages of behavioral notes to complete and a call with Dr. Price at noon to discuss the preliminary findings from the season. She had work to do, specific and real and necessary, and doing it well was the thing that mattered most right now. She turned away from the window. She went back to her desk. She started working. 3 weeks later, she received a call from Dale Overton that she had not been expecting, which was unusual, because Overton generally did not make unexpected calls. He was a man who scheduled things, who gave notice, who communicated in advance. When her phone rang at 7:30 in the evening, with his name on the screen, she picked up with the specific alertness of someone who understood that an unexpected call from a scheduled person meant something had happened. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. All right." "The man at the top of the chain," Overton said. "The buyer we have been building toward for the past 18 months. He was arrested this morning." She sat down. The cooperation from Garrett's group, combined with the financial evidence and the communication records that your camera footage helped us authenticate, the case was substantially stronger than it would have been without the evidence from your station and the events of the past 2 months. She was quiet for a moment. Where was he? He was in a hotel in a city that is not in this country, which made the arrest considerably more complicated than a domestic arrest, and which is why it took this long, and which is why I cannot tell you the details. What I can tell you is that it is confirmed, it is permanent, and it closes the primary loop of this investigation. She thought about the pale wolf on her camera footage. 7 seconds through a frame, at 11:47 on the night she brought Cinder in from the cold. She thought about 14 months of attempts to locate it. She thought about the sum of money Overton had declined to state in a room. "It is over," she said. "This chapter is over," he said. "The network, as networks do, will rebuild in different forms. But the specific operation that was targeting the Northern Rockies corridor, and the specific animal at the center of it, yes, that is over." She exhaled. "Mara," Overton said, "I have been doing this for 19 years. This investigation has been the most unusual of my career. That is a direct result of what you did, the documentation, the judgment calls, the morning with the cub." A pause. "I want you to know that I understand what that took." "Thank you," she said. She ended the call. She sat in the station in the evening quiet for a while, listening to the heating unit run, and the wind push at the walls and the small, ordinary sounds of a field station, doing its ordinary work of being a warm and lit place in the middle of a very large, very dark, very cold forest. Then she went to the window. The clearing was dark, stars above, hard and bright in the clear January sky, the kind of sky that appeared only when the temperature dropped below a certain point, and the atmosphere went crystalline and honest. The tree line was black against it. Nothing moved. She stood there for quite a long time. She was not waiting for anything specific. She was not watching for anything specific. She was simply standing in the place where things had happened, in the way that places where things have happened deserve to be stood in sometimes, not to see the things again, not to relive them, but to hold the weight of them with her full attention, and let that be a kind of acknowledgement. After a while, a shape appeared at the southern tree line. She did not move. The shape was large. It had the specific proportion she had come to know. High at the shoulder, wide through the chest. The movement of something that had been in this landscape for so long that the landscape had formed around it like water around a stone. It walked into the clearing with the same unhurried, purposeful pace she had watched on the camera footage, in the window glass, in the early morning light. It moved to approximately the center of the clearing and stopped. And it sat down. It sat in the snow of the clearing, in the dark, and it looked at the station. Mara looked back at it. She stood at the window and the pale wolf sat in the clearing, and between them was the glass, and the cold, and the 30 feet of snow, and something else that did not have a name she was prepared to use in a field report. She was not going to try to name it. She was going to let it be exactly what it was, in the same way she had decided, on the morning of the transfer, to let the 5 seconds be what they were. The wolf sat for 11 minutes. She counted. Not because the counting mattered, but because the discipline of counting gave her something to do with her attention that was not projecting or interpreting or doing any of the things she was trained not to do when she was observing. Then it stood. It looked at the station for one more moment. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. She watched it go until there was nothing left to see. The clearing was empty. The stars were sharp and cold above it. Somewhere in the dark forest, 12 wolves were doing what wolves did at night, and one of them was a cub with a healing leg that was getting steadier every time it appeared on camera, and one of them was a pale animal of extraordinary size that had spent 5 days organizing a vigil around a research station in the northern Rockies, and had done it with more composure and intelligence and patience than most humans brought to most things. She thought about that for a while. Then she went to her desk. She opened her field log. She wrote the date and the time. Then she wrote, "Single large wolf, pale coloring, present in clearing for approximately 11 minutes at 2100 hours. Animal stationary, for duration of observation. Withdrew to southern tree line without incident. No behavioral indicators of distress or aggression." She read it back. Then she added, in the margin, in smaller writing than her field notes usually contained, "Consistent with previous observation patterns. Animal in good health. Territory appears stable." She closed the notebook. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at the empty box near the heater, which she had not put away, which she was not going to put away, which was sitting there, with its interior still marked with the slight impression of the small body that had slept in it for 5 days, and that had walked out of this station into a cold clearing and changed the nature of things in a way that would take a long time to fully understand. She left it where it was. She went to bed. She slept soundly in the way she always slept at the station, deep and long, the sleep of a person whose body had made its accommodation with the demands of the place, and the work, and the particular quality of the cold. She did not dream, or if she did not remember it in the morning. What she remembered in the morning was the pale wolf sitting in the clearing, and the stars above it, and the 11 minutes of the two of them on either side of the glass. She remembered it the same way she remembered the morning of the transfer, as a fact that was also something more than a fact, the kind of thing that settled in you and stayed, not noisily, not dramatically, but with the quiet, permanent quality of something that had been added to the structure of who you were, and could not now be removed without changing the shape of the whole. She had entered this corridor as a field researcher with a specific assignment. She was leaving it. Eventually, when the season was done and the documentation was complete, and the investigation had moved past the phase where her daily presence was necessary, as something she did not have a precise professional label for. She was still a field researcher. She would always be that. But she was also, now, someone who had stood in a clearing at dawn and looked into the eyes of something very old and very certain, and had found, on examination, that she was certain too, not about everything, about this. She made coffee. She went to the window. The clearing was bright in the morning light, every surface catching the sun and holding it, the kind of winter brilliance that you had to squint to look at directly. The tree line stood clean and dark at the edges. Nothing moved. She drank her coffee and let the light do what light did in winter, in the northern Rockies, which was arrive with complete conviction and demand that you look at it. She looked at it. Then she went back to her desk and started her day. The work was specific and necessary and ongoing, which was the most important quality any work could have. The investigation was moving through its legal phases with the slow, inexorable progress that serious federal cases always achieved. The pack was in the northern section. The pale wolf was wherever it was, doing whatever it did, in the landscape that had held it for 7 years, and would hold it for many more. And Mara Calloway was in her station, at her desk, with her coffee, and her notebooks, and her camera data, and her field log open to a new page, doing the work that made the rest of it possible. Outside, the corridor went on. That was the most important thing. It went on. The trial happened in early September, in a federal courthouse in the nearest city large enough to hold proceedings of that scope. Mara drove down on the first day and sat in the gallery and listened to the opening statements, and she was struck, as she always was in formal legal settings, by the gap between the language used to describe events and the reality of those events, as she had lived them. The language was precise and careful and correct, and it described real things, and it said nothing about the quality of the cold, or the sound the clearing made in the half-dark before dawn, or the look in the pale wolf's eyes through a station window. She understood why. Courts were not in the business of that kind of description. Courts were in the business of establishing what happened and assigning consequences to it, and for that purpose, precise and careful language was exactly the right tool. She was a witness. She testified on the third day of the trial, and she was on the stand for nearly 2 hours, and she answered every question directly and accurately, and without embellishment. The defense attorney for Phil Garrett challenged her on several points, most of them related to the reliability of camera trap footage in low-light conditions, and the difficulty of definitively identifying individuals from partial body views. She answered those challenges carefully and completely, because they were legitimate points, and they deserved legitimate responses. When she stepped down from the stand, Carol Dean, who had been sitting at the edge of the gallery, gave her a small nod that meant she had done well. She sat through the remainder of the morning session, and then stepped outside at the lunch break to get some air. She found a bench near the entrance and sat on it and looked at the parking lot and the street beyond it and the ordinary, unremarkable world of a mid-sized city going about its midweek business. And she thought about how different it was from the corridor and how different it was from the clearing, and how all of these things, the courthouse and the gallery and the legal language and the city street, were real and important and necessary, and how they were also, somehow, the furthest possible distance from the thing they were trying to address. She thought about the pale wolf. She thought about it often, but she thought about it now, in the specific way she did, when she was in a place that had no trace of wilderness in it, as a kind of anchor, a real thing that existed at the other end of the very long and complicated chain of events that had brought her to this bench on this September afternoon. Her phone buzzed. It was Pete Cole. "Camera 2, he said, when she picked up. "Last night, 11:15. "What did you get?" "All of them. The whole pack. Moving south along the valley corridor." A pause. "And the large one. Clear footage. Best we have had." She closed her eyes for a moment. "How clear?" "Clear enough that the biometrics people are going to be very happy. We got the body length, the shoulder height, the facial structure. Everything we need to formally document it." She was quiet for a moment. "Mara, you still there?" "I am here. That is good news. I thought you would want to know." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the parking lot. The formal documentation of the pale wolf had been a conversation she had been having with Dr. Price and the corridor's wildlife management team for several months. It was the right thing to do. It would give the animal the official protection that came with being formally recognized as a significant specimen in a federally protected area. It would make removing it, harming it, or targeting it an even more serious federal offense than it already was. It would put the wolf's existence on record in a way that could not be disputed. It would also, necessarily, create a document that described the animal, its range, its characteristics, a document that would exist in databases and files and could, in theory, be found by people who were looking for the specific information it contained. She had talked with Dale Overton about this at length. He had described the enhanced security protocols being developed for sensitive species location data, the restricted access channels, the ways in which the system had learned from exactly this kind of situation. She believed him. She trusted that the people involved were serious about doing this correctly, but she also thought, at the back of her mind where she kept things she was still working through, that there was something inherently complicated about placing a wild thing in a record, about converting a living, moving, utterly sovereign creature into a set of data points that a human being could look at on a screen. Something was always lost in that conversion. She was not sure anything could be done about that. It was simply a reality of the world she worked in. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the sky above the courthouse, which was a flat, bleached blue without a cloud in it, a clear September sky. Miles south of the corridor, miles south of the ridge and the valley, and the camera traps, and the station, and the clearing, and everything that had happened in the clearing. But the same sky. She thought about Cinder on the camera footage, moving through the frame at 11:15 on a September night, part of the pack, fluid and confident and alive. She thought about the morning she had set Cinder down in the snow. She thought about what it had felt like to watch something small walk away from her, toward something large and certain and real, and to know that she had helped make that walk possible, and to know that her help was no longer needed and never would be again. That was the part she had never quite found the right words for. Not the danger of it, not the strangeness of it, not the way it looked or felt in the cold early morning. The simple fact of something being complete, of a small and frightened creature becoming a moving, confident part of its world again, and the particular quality of the silence that followed once it had crossed the line from the space where it needed you to the space where it did not. She had spent a lot of her career working toward moments like that. This one was different, because of what had happened in the 30 feet between the station door and the wolf, because of the 5 seconds of held breath while a cub took its first steps across open ground towards something it had been separated from, because of the pale wolf lowering its head and the morning light coming over the ridge and the clearing going back to silence. She had needed that moment. She had not known, before it happened, how much she needed it. She stood up from the bench. She went back inside for the afternoon session. The trial went on for 4 more days. At its conclusion, Phil Garrett and 2 others received prison sentences. The remaining men received a combination of significant fines, probation, and permanent bans from federal wildlife areas. It was not a perfect outcome. No legal outcome was perfect. But it was substantial, and it mattered, and the work of the investigators and the attorneys and the researchers and the rangers who had contributed to it was real work that would have real effects. Mara drove back to the corridor on the morning after the verdict. She drove through the city, and then through the smaller towns, and then through the stretches of road, where there were no towns, only the landscape opening up on either side. Hills giving way to the broad shelf of the plateau, and then the plateau giving way to the first pine-covered ridges of the Rockies proper, growing larger and more serious with every mile. She reached the access road in the early afternoon, and drove it slowly, windows down, despite the chill, because she wanted the air, and the smell of the pines, and the sound of nothing particular, just the ordinary ambience of the wild landscape, doing its ordinary wild things. She parked at the station, and got out. The clearing was still, the air was cool, and carried the particular quality of early autumn, clean and sharp, and slightly melancholy, in the way that the first real cold always was, the kind of cold that told you honestly what was coming, without any of the softening that summer days provided. The leaves of the few deciduous trees at the edges of the clearing were beginning to turn. Not far into it yet, just the first edges of color, but there. She stood in the clearing for a while. The tree line was as it always was, still, dark at the edges, giving nothing away. She did not expect to see anything. It was afternoon, and wolves moved at dawn and dusk and through the night, and the pack was somewhere in the northern section of the corridor, doing whatever the pack was doing, which was none of her immediate concern, and all of her long-term professional attention. She just stood there, in the place where things had happened, not because anything dramatic was happening in it right now, but because of what had already happened in it, and because the ground remembered even when it looked like it did not. She stayed for a few minutes. Then she unlocked the station door, carried her bags inside, set her pack down, hung up her jacket, and went to the small propane stove to put on coffee. She turned on her laptop. She opened her field log. She found the last entry and read it over. Then she moved to a new page and wrote the date and the time. She wrote, "Return to station, following conclusion of trial proceedings. Corridor conditions, early autumn. Temperature approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Good visibility. Pack activity in northern section confirmed via camera trap footage from previous night. Camera 2, trail camera 4, both showing full pack movement in healthy formation." She paused. Then she added, All 12 pack members accounted for, including one juvenile female in full integration. No behavioral indicators of disturbance. Pack appears stable and operating normally within established territory. She read it back. Then she wrote one more line. She wrote, "Good to be back." She saved the file. Outside the window, the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light in the mountains did in autumn, tilting toward the west, going gold along the ridgeline, casting long shadows from the trees across the clearing below. In an hour it would be gone, and the blue-gray of early evening would take its place, and then the dark. She sat at her desk and drank her coffee, and looked out the window at the light. She was not waiting for anything. She was not watching for any specific thing. She was simply there, in the place she had chosen, doing the work she had given her professional life to, in a world that was large enough, and complex enough, and full enough of creatures that had their own sovereignty, and their own intelligence, and their own understanding of things, that no research program had yet come close to fully capturing. She was there. Outside, the light faded. The clearing went to gray. The tree line went to dark. And somewhere in the northern section of the corridor, in the spaces between the trees where the autumn air was cold and clean, and full of information that only certain kinds of creatures could read, the pack moved through their landscape in the dark, following a pale leader whose existence had now been formally noted in a federal database, but whose reality, whose actual, living, breathing, intelligent, sovereign reality, had never needed any record to be complete. They moved as they always moved. The next morning, Pete Cole drove up the access road at 7:30, the way he often did now that he had been assigned to the northern section permanently. He parked at the edge of the clearing, and walked to the station door, and knocked twice, which was his pattern, and she let him in, and poured him coffee, which was her pattern, and they stood at the desk, and looked at the overnight camera footage together, which had become their shared morning routine. The footage from camera 4 showed the pack moving across the lower ridge at 3:20 in the morning, 12 animals in loose formation, moving west. Cinder was near the back of the group, moving freely, and without any observable adjustment in the left leg gait. Full weight, full stride, the leg healed. "She's doing well," Pete said. "She is," Mara said. He watched the footage to its end, then he picked up his coffee. How did it feel, being back in the courthouse? She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about all of Pete's questions, because he asked them genuinely, and they deserved genuine answers. "Strange," she said. "The way it always feels strange to describe something in formal language that you experienced in a completely different register. But necessary. Yes, completely necessary." He nodded. He looked at the tree line through the window, the way he always looked at it, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had been in this corridor long enough to understand that the things worth watching were not always the things that were visible. "Garrett got 4 years, he said. "Yes. Carol Dean thinks it will be reduced on appeal." She mentioned that. "Does that bother you?" She considered. The fact that he is in the legal system, and the case is on record, and the network is disrupted. That is what matters. The specific number of years is significant, but it is not the whole of what has been accomplished. Pete was quiet for a moment. "The Pale Wolf," he said. "The formal documentation process starts next month." "Yes, I will be part of the assessment team." "Are you comfortable with that?" It was exactly the kind of question she had come to expect from him. Direct, specific, aimed at the thing she might be reluctant to address, rather than the thing that was easier to discuss. She had come to appreciate it. "I have concerns about data security," she said. "Overton has addressed them to my satisfaction. Yes, I am comfortable with it." He nodded again. He finished his coffee. He set the cup down. "I want to say something, and I want to say it now, because once the formal process starts, there will not be much space for this kind of conversation." She looked at him. "What you did," he said. "Not just the morning with the cub. All of it. The 5 nights at the station, the documentation, the decisions you made in real time, with no framework and no precedent. I have been doing this work for less than 2 years, and I know I am still learning, but I want you to know that I have been paying attention, and what I have seen you do in the past 10 months has changed how I understand what this work is supposed to look like." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "That means something." He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way people sometimes did after saying something sincere that they had been working up to for a while. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I have the eastern cameras to check," he said. "I know. I will take the ridge." He left. She stood at the window and watched his truck pull away down the access road, and she thought about what he had said, and she let it settle into the same place where she kept other things that deserved to be held carefully. She put on her jacket. She laced her boots. She checked her pack and her radio and her field notebook. She went outside into the autumn morning, which was bright and cold and completely honest about what it was, and she walked across the clearing toward the trail that led up to the ridge, where the camera traps were waiting with their records of the previous night and the night before that, and all the nights that accumulated into a picture of a living landscape doing what living landscapes do, cycling through its seasons, feeding and moving, and adjusting and enduring, entirely indifferent to the human events that swirled at its edges, and entirely necessary to the humans who, at their best and most attentive, tried to understand it. She climbed the ridge. Below her, the clearing was small and white and still, a clean space in the middle of a very large forest, marked by the tracks of whatever had crossed it in the dark. Above her, the sky was the particular, precise blue of an autumn morning in the mountains, the kind of blue that was a color and a temperature and a quality of light all at once, the kind of blue that only people who spent time in high places saw regularly. She climbed toward it. She had work to do. She always had work to do, and she had learned, over 6 years and one autumn that changed the nature of everything, that the work was the answer to most questions, not the only answer, but the steadiest one. The one that was always there when you came back to it, specific and real and waiting, in the same way the forest was always there, and the corridor was always there, and the pale wolf was always there, moving through its landscape with the knowledge of 7 years, and the patience of something that had never been required to hurry. She reached the ridge. She stopped, looked north. Miles of forest in every direction, the corridor stretching north and south, the ridgelines moving away in both directions like the spines of something enormous and sleeping. She knew this view well. She had been looking at it for almost a year. She looked at it now and felt, as she always felt when she stood somewhere like this, that the world was considerably larger and more serious than the daily work of documentation and testimony and legal proceedings could ever quite capture, and that this was not a problem but a fact, and that the right response to a fact was not to change it, but to move through it, with the most accurate attention you could bring to bear. She brought her attention to bear. She pulled out her field notebook. She wrote the date and the time and the conditions. Then she wrote what she saw. Spring came late to the northern Rockies, as it always did, arriving in stages rather than all at once, a slow unlocking of the landscape from one state to another, ice giving way to mud, mud giving way to the first tentative green along the south-facing slopes, green growing slowly more convincing, until one morning a person would walk outside and realize that the world had finished changing while they were looking at other things. Mara noticed it on a Thursday in late April, when she stepped out of the station to check the path to her nearest camera trap, and found that the ground under her boots was soft, in a way it had not been the day before. Not wet, not muddy, just yielding, like the earth had relaxed some tension it had been holding all winter, and was now prepared to be a different thing. She stood in the clearing, and breathed in, and the air tasted like pine and cold water, and something organic and alive, that had no name, but was unmistakable. The formal documentation of the pale wolf had been completed in early March, after 6 weeks of careful field assessment by a team that included Mara, 2 independent wildlife biologists, and a biometrics specialist who worked exclusively with rare and undocumented species. The process had been conducted with more security protocols than Mara had ever participated in for a field study, restricted communication channels, GPS data encrypted and segmented, physical documentation moved under controlled custody. Overton had overseen it personally. She had trusted the process, because she trusted him, and because she had come to understand that the alternative to careful formal documentation was not the absence of a record, but the existence of a worse one. The report that emerged from the assessment was 43 pages long and represented, according to the 2 independent biologists, the most significant wildlife documentation produced in the Northern Rockies in 11 years. The pale wolf, formally designated with the taxonomic notation appropriate to an undocumented specimen of confirmed genetic distinctiveness, was identified as an adult male of approximately 9 years. Its size placed it in the 98th percentile of recorded wolf specimens in North America. Its estimated territory, reconstructed from camera data and GPS tracking of pack movement across multiple seasons, covered 91 square miles of the northern corridor. It had been in that territory for every one of the past 7 years. What struck Mara most, reading the final assessment, was not the size or the territorial range or the genetic distinctiveness, though all of those were remarkable. What struck her was the 9 years. The animal had been operating in this landscape, building its knowledge of it, establishing its pack, maintaining its territory, surviving winters that killed less experienced animals, navigating a landscape that had also, for 3 of those 9 years, been actively surveilled by people who wanted to take it. For 9 years, without once being formally identified or documented. 9 years of being exactly what it was, in exactly the place it chose to be, without anyone's permission, and without any record's confirmation. She kept thinking about that. The court proceedings had moved through their various phases with the slow and inevitable quality of serious legal cases. 2 additional pleas had been entered in the months since the initial filing. The man who had been arrested overseas was in a protracted extradition process that Carol Dean said would take at least another year to resolve. Garrett was serving his sentence. 2 of the men who had come to the station, the younger ones, the ones who had been at the lowest rungs of the operational hierarchy, had cooperated extensively with investigators and received reduced consequences that reflected the usefulness of their cooperation. Mara did not have complex feelings about this. The legal system made its calculations, and she made hers, and they were not always the same calculations, and that was the nature of operating in a world where multiple systems of accountability ran simultaneously. By late spring, Pete Cole had been promoted to lead officer for the northern section, which meant he was her primary contact in the corridor management structure, and also that she saw him approximately 3 times a week, which was more than she saw most people in her life, and which she found she did not mind at all. He was methodical and precise, and he asked good questions, and he had, over the past several months, developed the particular quality of attention that she had come to think of as the defining characteristic of someone who would be very good at this work for a very long time. He called her on a morning in May, 2 days before she was due to leave the station for the end-of-season break that Dr. Price had negotiated into her annual contract. She had been at the station for nearly 9 months, the longest continuous field assignment of her career, and the break was necessary, and she was looking forward to it, and also, in the particular way that field researchers always felt about leaving places they had lived in and paid close attention to, slightly reluctant. "Camera 3, Pete said. 6 this morning." She pulled up the footage on her laptop. The camera on the northern slope showed the valley below in the first clear light of a May morning. Green was beginning to show along the lower edges, the valley floor warming faster than the slopes, the seasonal succession starting at the bottom and working its way up. It was beautiful footage, the kind she saved to a separate folder because it served a different purpose than behavioral documentation. It was the landscape making its annual argument for its own existence. Through the valley, in loose formation, a pack of 12 wolves moved east at a traveling pace. She had been documenting this pack for 11 months. She could identify most of them individually now. She watched them cross the frame, near the back of the group, moving at a pace that matched the adults around her and bearing her weight evenly on all 4 legs, was a wolf that was smaller than the others but no longer small. She had been growing steadily through the winter and spring, adding the lean, functional muscle of a young wolf reaching its full development. Her gait was fluid and correct. There was no trace of the injury in her movement. Mara watched the clip 3 times. Then she wrote in her field log, "Camera 3, 6:14 hours. Pack movement. Full complement. 12 animals. Moving east through valley corridor. Juvenile female fully mobile. Gait normal. Size consistent with healthy development for age. No behavioral markers of injury history. Animal fully integrated into pack hierarchy, confirmed by position and interactional patterns with other pack members." She paused. Then she added, "Cinder assessed as fully recovered and thriving." She read it back. She closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the station, in the morning light that came through the window and lay across the desk and the notebooks, and the folded box that was still on the shelf where she had put it in late November, right where she had placed it, undisturbed. She got up and went to the window. The clearing was bright and green at the edges now. The the spring growth coming in along the margins of the snow-cleared ground, thin and tentative but real. In another month, the clearing would look entirely different, the grasses tall, the flowers that bloomed briefly in alpine meadows beginning to show at the higher elevations, the whole landscape in the particular state of productive extravagance that followed a hard northern winter. She had seen it happen gradually over the past weeks, and it still surprised her, every morning, how much the world could change between one dawn and the next when the season was turning. She thought about what she would write in the end-of-season summary. She had been composing it in pieces for the past month, adding sections as they became clear, revising the ones that needed revision, leaving the sections that were not yet fully formed alone until they were ready. The section on the Pale Wolf documentation was finished. The section on the legal proceedings was finished. The section on pack behavior and pack dynamics and the extraordinary events of November was the one she was still working on, because it required the kind of language that existed at the edge of what she could say precisely, and she was not going to compromise precision for completion. She would finish it in the next 2 days. She always finished what she started. There was a section she had not originally planned to include, that had grown out of conversations with Dr. Price and Gary Marsh and Louise Ferris about the implications of what had happened in the corridor over the past winter. It was a section about protection, about what it meant to protect a place and the animals in it, and about the relationship between the human systems of protection, the legal frameworks, the enforcement operations, the research documentation, and the forms of protection that existed in the corridor, independent of any human involvement. The Pale Wolf had been running the northern section for 9 years. During 3 of those years, it had been actively targeted by people with significant resources and considerable experience in the business of finding and taking things. It had not been found. It had not been taken. Not because the people looking for it were incompetent, they were not, but because the animal they were looking for had an understanding of the landscape it lived in that was more complete and more sophisticated than anything that could be replicated from the outside looking in. It had known its territory, it had known its pack, it had known how to be present without being findable and visible without being catchable, for 9 years, in a landscape that people watched from the edges and thought they understood. And then a cub had been injured and separated, in circumstances that remained unclear, and a researcher had picked the cub up and carried it to a warm place, and the Pale Wolf had made a series of decisions in response to that. Decisions that were not random, and not instinctual in the simple sense of that word. Decisions that carried the quality of something reasoned. Something that assessed a situation and chose a response based on that assessment. And the chain of events that followed had changed the course of an 18-month federal investigation and resulted in the disruption of a trafficking network that had been operating for 4 years. She had thought about this often. She had thought about it in the courtroom, and on the drive back from the verdict, and on the ridge at dawn, and in the station in the evenings. She had thought about what it meant, if anything, and she had arrived, slowly and carefully, at a conclusion that she was not entirely comfortable calling a conclusion, because it was the kind of thing that resisted being fully closed. The Pale Wolf had not needed her, not in the way that the cub had needed her. The Pale Wolf had been surviving, effectively and completely, long before she arrived in the corridor, and would continue long after she left. But there had been, in the 5 days of November, something that functioned like a recognition, not of Mara specifically, not of her as a person, but of an action she had taken. An action that meant something in the terms the wolf used to measure things. She had kept the cub alive. She had kept it safe in conditions where it could not have survived alone. She had returned it intact. And the Pale Wolf had organized 19 animals in a systematic response to a threat that those animals, on their own, could not have identified with the precision they ultimately demonstrated. A threat that Overton's investigation had been working toward for 18 months, and that the wolves had, in 5 days, helped bring to a critical point. She was not going to write, in a federal field report, that the wolves had understood the situation. That would not survive peer review, and it would not serve the documentation she was trying to build. But she was going to write, carefully and precisely, and with full citation of the behavioral evidence, that what had occurred in the corridor in November represented a class of animal-human interaction that existing frameworks were insufficient to describe, and that the gap between existing frameworks and what had actually occurred was itself a significant finding, and that the gap deserved ongoing attention. That was what she was going to write. She heard Pete's truck coming up the access road at 8 o'clock, his usual arrival time on Thursdays. She heard it park. She heard his two familiar knocks. She opened the door. He came in and she poured him coffee, and he sat at the small table near the window while she stood at the desk, and they talked for a while about the end-of-season logistics and the transition plan and the camera trap maintenance schedule for the summer months, when the corridor would be managed by a smaller team. Then he said, in the way he said things that mattered, directly, without building up to them, the corridor name. She looked at him. Louise Ferris sent the proposal to the regional office last week. It has been informally approved pending the standard review. The formal designation will come through in the autumn. What designation? She said, though she had heard a suggestion of this in a conversation with Gary Marsh 2 months earlier, and had not fully known what to think about it. The northern section, Pete said. The section above the ridge, from Miller Creek to the northern boundary. Louise's proposal is to designate it as a named section within the corridor, a formal recognition of its significance as a habitat area for undocumented and rare species. He paused. She is recommending it be called the Callaway section. The station was quiet. Mara looked out the window at the clearing, at the spring green coming in along the margins, at the trees that had stood in their rows all winter and were now filling in with the slower, deeper green of full leaf, the corridor going from its winter spareness to its summer abundance in the gradual, certain way of places that knew how to be patient. I appreciate that, she said, but I would suggest a different name. Pete waited. If Louise is open to it, she said, I would like it named for the corridor itself, what the corridor represents, what it has been doing since the wolves were reintroduced, the way it connects things that would otherwise be separated. She stopped. Then she said, call it the Cinder Passage. Pete looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. I think that is right. She nodded. She looked back out the window. In the 2 days before she left for the end-of-season break, she completed the section of the summary report she had been working on, and she packed her bags in the methodical way she had always packed for transitions between assignments, and she made one last check of all 6 camera traps and verified that they were operational and connected and recording. On her last evening, she sat at the desk and went through her notebooks, the official field log and the personal one, both of them dense with 9 months of attention paid to a specific piece of the world. She read back through sections she had not looked at since writing them. The first week in the corridor, when the camera traps were new and the terrain was unfamiliar, and every day was a new addition to the picture she was building. The first signs of the pack in October, the footage of 9 wolves in tight formation that she had been genuinely excited about. The November footage, the night she found the cub. The window and the eyes. She read those sections slowly. She did not try to make them into something they were not. They were what they were, the record of something that had happened, in the exact terms she had used to describe it at the time, with the accuracy she had brought to everything she documented. When she finished, she closed both notebooks. She went to the shelf at the back of the station, where the folded travel box was still stored. She picked it up. She stood with it for a moment. Then she carried it to the supply room and placed it in the box she was leaving for the next researcher, with a note that said, "This box is clean and in good condition. Please use it if you need it." She went to the window one more time. It was full dark. The clearing was quiet. The spring air came through the slightly open window. She had left it open a crack because the evening was mild, the mildest it had been since October, and it carried the smell of the forest in early spring, mud and pine and the first green things, the smell of a landscape waking up. Nothing moved in the clearing. She stood there for a long time anyway. She was not waiting. She understood, by now, that the waiting was not the point. The point was being present in the place that mattered, with the full and specific attention of someone who had learned, through months of careful work and one set of events that changed the shape of everything, that the most important thing was not to see. It was to look, steadily and honestly, and without flinching, from the complexity of what you found. To look, and to record what you found, and to trust that the record, built carefully and honestly over time, would stand for something. She looked. The clearing was still. And somewhere in the northern section of the corridor, in the territory that would be formally named in the autumn, in the deep forest above the ridge where the cameras recorded what they could and missed the rest, in the spaces between the trees where things moved that no record had yet fully found, 12 wolves were doing what they did every night, In the landscape they had made their own, at a pace and in a manner entirely their own, with a completeness that required no observation to confirm it. One of them was young and growing, and her leg was straight beneath her when she walked. One of them was large and pale, and 9 years old, and had been here before anyone was watching. They moved through the dark together. The forest went on. The corridor went on. And in the morning, Mara Calloway would drive down the access road and onto the main road, and south toward the city, and the next phase of her work. And the corridor would continue without her, as it always had, and always would, and the cameras would record what they could, and the rest would remain exactly what it had always been, private, and moving, and beyond the edge of language, and entirely real. She closed the window. She went to bed. She slept. Outside, the spring night went on, in the way that spring nights in the mountains went on, full of things becoming other things, the slow and continuous transformation of a world that had never needed anyone to watch it in order to know what to do next. It knew. It had always known. It would go on knowing, long after every record had been written and filed, and eventually, in the way of all records, forgotten. Long after the names and the documents and the careful, precise language were gone, the forest would still be there, and the wolves would still be there, and the thing that happened in the clearing in the last days of November would still have happened, permanent, in the way that real things were permanent, held in the specific matter of the world itself. The ground remembered. That was enough. That had always been enough.